Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, it's my great pleasure to introduce to the Assembly today, and on behalf of the member for Calgary-Glenmore, there is a number of guests in the gallery today from the Ashmally Council of the Prairies and the Ashmally Council of Edmonton. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Mr. Speaker, it's almost the weekend, and I know that like so many Albertans outside of this chamber, we're all looking forward to soaking up the short Alberta summers. Weekends are a chance for barbecues, bike rides, and camping trips with our friends, families, and our neighbours. Weekends are pretty great after all, aren't they? Well, we have labour unions to thank for them. Without trade unions, there would have been no pressure for employers to limit the amount of time employees spend working. In fact, the history of the working week is the history of the labour unions. On March 25, 1872, the Toronto Printers Union went on strike to ask their employers for a shorter work week. At a time when unions were still illegal, this was the first time a large group of workers had stood up for themselves and their rights through a strike. And soon enough, the Toronto Printers Union had the support and encouragement from other groups of workers who felt the same way. 3 weeks later, around 10,000 workers marched through the streets of Toronto to show solidarity and to make a statement that they demanded to be taken seriously. And while their employers didn't take them seriously at the time, it was the government of the day, Prime Minister Macdonald, that passed the Trade Union Act, making unions legal. From job-protected leave, paid holiday leave, to on-the-job protections, labour unions have given us all so many things that we take for granted in the workplace today. This government's attack on labour unions is an attack on all workers of this province. Workers in places like Cargill and JBS meatpacking plants, whom this government failed to protect them from the negligence of their profit-driven employers. Workers like young people trying to earn money for their rising tuition costs or just trying to earn money to support their family with the rising cost of living. Workers like so many of my constituents putting together their overtime paychecks, paycheck to support their families. As long as this government continues to pick the pockets of Albertans to pay for their multi-billion-dollar giveaways to their wealthy corporate friends, on this side of the House, we'll continue to stand up for Albertans that are actually the backbone of the economy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP talk about standing up against bullying and protecting workers from being bullied in the workplace. And we must always stand up against bullying. Full stop. However, we need to be careful not to label everything and everyone we don't like as bullying. Not liking something does not make it bullying. On numerous occasions, I've had people heckle me, both in this chamber and outside. I would venture that everyone in this chamber has been heckled at some point. It's part of our parliamentary traditions, and it's not bullying. With that said, yesterday, the MLA for St. Albert called out another member for non-verbal intimidation. What was this supposed intimidation? The member wasn't specific, but it appears that she took offense to a member looking at her as she spoke. Last time I checked, this was still allowed. In fact, I was always told that it was polite to look at somebody when they were speaking. I would suggest that if someone doesn't want people looking at them when they speak, perhaps they are not in the right field. When the Speaker called her to order, she refused to apologize. This abuse of the parliamentary system came hours after the member for Edmonton Gold Bar gave a speech celebrating the death of former UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. He said, quote, "If nothing else goes right for me today, I can at least count on enjoying the fact that Margaret Thatcher is still dead. And the only thing I regret about Margaret Thatcher's death is that it happened probably 30 years too late." While I understand that some may disagree with her politics, celebrating the death of the UK's first female Prime Minister is absolutely over the line and shameful. I didn't hear any of the members opposite condemn the comments made by the member from Edmonton Gold Bar. However, they quickly got on Twitter to attack the member for this supposed non-verbal intimidation. The double standard must be called out, and this continual virtual signaling must end.
Honourable members, all members will know the long-standing tradition of member statements, the member allowing that member to go uninterrupted for the duration of their 2 minutes, even if those members are on your own team. The Honourable Member for Drumheller-Stettler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, anti-Semitism is evil. Sadly, it is an enduring and pernicious hatred that continues to find support and safe harbor across the world. As legislators, we have a duty to fight this evil, to educate, and to stand with Jewish Albertans. Unfortunately, as it has endured, anti-Semitism isn't always as easy to spot as it once was. The new anti-Semitism that we face is more subversive and nuanced than the open and overt hatred that has dominated in the past. It has taken a form where instead of targeting individuals or the Jewish faith, the anti-Semites now target the Jewish homeland, the State of Israel. One of the ways that the Jewish people are now attacked is through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement. This movement seeks to cause economic harm to Israel and the Jewish people, and it seeks to ostracize them in the international community, all while casting a facade of being an advocate for the Palestinian people. But let us be absolutely clear, BDS is an intentional attack on the Jewish people. It is the face of the new anti-Semitism. Mr. Speaker, this is relevant to a current discussion that we are having in this legislature because unfortunately parts of the Canadian union establishment have been infected by this hatred. Sadly, some radical union bosses have signed up as supporters of the anti-Semitic BDS movement, Unifor in 2017, CUWU in 2009, CUPW in 2008, CUPE Ontario in 2006, and the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, as the Premier said yesterday, can you imagine being a Jewish union worker and being forced through your own dues to support this anti-Semitism disguised as political activism? Mr. Speaker, it's time to say no. It's time to give Alberta workers a choice to reject the anti-Semitic BDS movement, and frankly, a choice to opt out of even legitimate political activities that a worker may oppose. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has a statement to make.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to a beloved and influential member of our community who passed away on June 23rd, 2020, at the age of 96. Mary Reimer was an important part of the founding and nurturing of the progressive movement here in the province of Alberta, a lasting legacy to which we are all most grateful, now more than ever. Mary was born in Brooksby, Saskatchewan, and moved to Regina to pursue an education and later to begin work at the Co-op refinery, where she met Neil, her husband, for more than 6 decades. They moved to Alberta in the early 1950s and made their home in Edmonton. Mary played a crucial role in the formation of the New Democratic Party of Alberta. Together with her husband Neil, who was to become the first leader of Alberta's New Democrats, brought together Albertans from all corners of the province dedicated to building a just, caring, and equitable future for all. Mary was also true to her nickname, M-E-R-R-Y, Mary, in all aspects of her life. From golf to bowling, social clubs to party events, Mary was energetic, gracious, and, well, Mary, and with all the things that she encountered and people. I remember Mary and Neil coming to some of my first fundraisers when I was starting to get involved, and I was struck by how friendly and supported the Reimers always were. And Mary, of course, was always willing to give me lots of free advice. Our caucus would like to express our sympathy to the friends and family of Mary Reimer and our deepest respect for all she has done to build a better world for all Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Banff-Kananaskis.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to be one of many women elected by Albertans to serve in this legislature. The effort to get more women involved in politics and elected into the legislature is not a partisan endeavor, and is something that we should all want to see. In fact, during the last election, nearly 50% of our United Conservative candidates were women, and that is something I'm incredibly proud of. But political discourse has become toxic, and there is no denying that, and it actually scares some off from running. Sadly, something we heard yesterday here in this legislature, amplified by left-wing Twitter, is a plain and outright example of the worst case of political toxic discourse. The disgusting comments we heard, which celebrated the death of the greatest female leader in the 20th century, and in fact lamented she didn't die sooner, will not be encouraging to any woman who wishes to seek elected office in the future. Mr. Speaker, as a woman who has earned the honor of representing my constituents in this place, Margaret Thatcher has always been a personal hero. She grew up as the daughter of a humble shopkeeper who instilled in her conservative values, most importantly that through hard work, merit, and self-determination, anything is possible. Mr. Speaker, I too grew up with those values. They were instilled in me from a young age by my family, and they've also been a guiding light in my decision to advance into the political sphere. Mr. Speaker, in Margaret Thatcher's rise to become one of the most powerful and influential leaders in the world history, she faced countless obstacles and she conquered every single one. They told her she couldn't do it because she was a woman, and they told her to be quiet because her voice was too high. The people who said these things fade from our memory and into oblivion, but she is immortalized for all of time. Mr. Speaker, she faced down the tyranny of the Soviet communism and won. She faced down the forces of obstructing economic progress and she won. A dictator once thought he'd test her iron will, and she sent the Royal Navy across the world to defend the rights of free people. Margaret Thatcher helped build the free world, and to hear an elected official across the aisle celebrate her death in this House is appalling. Mr. Speaker, us Conservative women, we don't back down.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are rules in this workplace, as there are in every single workplace. I do a job where I signed up for debate. I signed up to have my ideas challenged. I signed up for a vigorous contest of values. I signed up for democracy, and I will not apologize for doing my job. We have over 100 years of history and rules on how we respect one another while upholding our duty to challenge one another. That is how we serve the people who sent us to this place to represent them. Those rules do not include being subjected to staring contests, posturing, mocking, or being subjected to targeted intimidation while trying to engage in democratic debate. Last night, I was doing my job. I was debating Bill 30, a bill I profoundly oppose because it is a bill that attacks public health care and paves the way for disastrous American-style health care in Alberta. I will continue to do my job. I will stand up for the right to be heard, for the women watching and for the women who will follow in our footsteps and eventually fill these seats. Change is coming. This chamber can reflect the diversity of the people who live in our great province. I and my colleagues will lead that change, and we will not be intimidated.
The honourable member for Airdrie East has a statement.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Venezuela have suffered immeasurably under the extremism and corruption of socialist dictators like Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. Chavez seized control of businesses and starved his people while poverty and crime soared. Conditions in Venezuela have become even more desperate under his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Under martial law, he has seized control of the country's judiciary, opposition parties, and he has jailed or assassinated his political opponents and blocked shipments of foreign aid. His socialist policies have resulted in extreme shortages of food and medicines, with malnutrition and illness now widespread and chronic. His socialist policies has resulted in a complete collapse of Venezuela's economy. Millions have fled his corrupt, murderous regime. These socialist dictators have been widely condemned by the international community, widely condemned by everyone except the socialist left, including some of the NDP's closest friends and allies. Last year, several major Canadian unions, including the Canadian Union of Public Employees, actually voiced their support for Maduro, attacking those who stand against him. CUPE's position rightly outraged those of its members who support freedom and democracy, and it rightly outraged its members of Venezuelan heritage. They believe strongly that their union's position undermines efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela and does not represent their views. In the words of a Venezuelan CUPE member, I pay my union dues for the union to represent me, not to screw me around. Mr. Speaker, unions like CUPE can spend their members' dues on these kinds of political activities without fear or repercussion because because they know their members are powerless to stop it. It's clear that union members deserve control over how their dues are spent, and this is exactly why our government introduced Bill 32. Balance will finally be restored in Alberta's workplaces.
Honourable members, I have provided a caution about interrupting during member statements. If all members of the Assembly aren't going to be respectful of that, I can assure you that the long-standing of tradition of uninterrupted member statements will degrade to a state that they will be difficult to continue with. The Honourable Member for Livingston McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the former Premier made another blatantly misleading comment while defending her union boss buddies' anti-oil agenda. She said, and I quote, "I personally worked at various times with representatives from Uniform who were incredibly supportive of TMX and other pipelines and worked very closely with us to make that happen," end quote. That is quite a bold statement from a past Premier who openly opposed pipelines, when the facts reveal that Unifor has openly opposed at least 3 different pipeline projects which would have brought jobs and prosperity to our beautiful province. Don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. Unifor themselves filed evidence against the Kinderborn expansion, filed for a judicial review to stop Northern Gateway, and openly welcomed the demise of Keystone XL. And that's not all. The now leader of the opposition desperately wants Albertans to believe her close ally and former NDP running mate, Gilbert McGowan, is pro-oil and gas. Well, Mr. Speaker, Gilbert's track record on this is clear. He opposed at least 5 major pipeline projects here in Alberta. But that's not enough for the anti-oil AFL front group across the aisle to try and gaslight Albertans into believing their union buddies aren't anti-oil. They've also helped unions push their anti-oil messages. Remember when the member for Lethbridge West proudly accompanied the AFL in their efforts to kill Northern Gateway? She even helped write a book with instructions on blockading resource development. Mr. Speaker, with that in mind, imagine being a hard-working union member in the energy sector here in Alberta, where the socialists opposite want union bosses to force you to pay for anti-energy political crusades that will destroy your own job. Mr. Speaker, that's not fair, and that's why we brought in Bill 32. We are leveling the playing field and giving workers a choice. We're keeping our campaign promises to ensure workers get to choose the political activities that they fund.
Hear, hear.
Statement.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in recognition of Imam Day, celebrated by Ismaili Muslims around the world on July 11th each year. On this day in 1957, His Highness the Aga Khan became the 49th Imam of the world's Shia Ismaili Muslims. His Highness is a global humanitarian leader committed to improving the quality of life for communities worldwide. In Alberta, he has commissioned a multi-generational housing complex in Calgary and the Aga Khan Gardens in Edmonton, commensurate of his work across the globe to foster peace, pluralism, care for the environment, celebration of the arts and architecture, and care for the vulnerable. Imam Day presents an opportunity to highlight the Ismaili Muslim community's ethic of volunteerism and compassion in Alberta, including Stampede and Canada Day breakfasts, which bring together diverse communities. In response to the current pandemic, Ismaili civic volunteers have been busy nationwide, sewing 13,000 cloth face masks for essential service workers, donating 22,000 pounds of non-perishable food to local food banks, hosting a national blood drive, and have committed 70,000 volunteer hours to support frontline crisis response with the Kids Help Phone. Led by His Highness the Aga Khan Development Network, a group of international non-denominational development organizations work to improve the quality of life for people in the developing world in more than 30 countries through social, economic, and cultural programs. One example of the exemplary work they do is a project in Afghanistan that aims to advance women's empowerment by increasing their social and economic participation in supporting their livelihoods. In doing so, the network is able to support sustainable civil societies across the developing world. Mr. Speaker, through you and on behalf of the entire Legislative Assembly, I wish Ismaili Muslims across Alberta for Imam Day a heartfelt Kushali Mubarak.
Honourable members. The time is now 1:50, and it is oral question period, and the Leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Ottawa released a fiscal update, which indicated the projected deficit for 2020 will be more than $343 billion, and debt higher than $1.2 trillion. These are sobering numbers, and they illustrate the scale of the damage caused by an energy crash and a global pandemic. Canadians will have a range of opinions on that federal government's performance, but at least we will have some numbers on which to base the debate. The same cannot be said in Alberta. Why has this Premier failed to provide Albertans with an update on the state of our province's finances?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in point of fact, this government's been far more transparent than the federal government about the state of our finances in the COVID crisis. We've indicated that we believe the deficit for this year likely will be at least $20 billion. And the Honourable Minister of Finance will be presenting a comprehensive fiscal update to Albertans, I believe in August. And it will underscore what I said on March 16th, that there is a great fiscal reckoning that lies ahead for us. At this time, however, we are focused on saving both lives and livelihoods.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not quite true. In 2019, the Premier hid his plan to raise taxes to pay for a $4.7 billion corporate handout until after the federal election. In 2020, his finance minister knew his budget was pure fantasy before he introduced it. And last month, the government rewrote the law to hide their year-end financials and then lied to the Assembly about it being the Auditor General's decision. Why won't this Premier show Albertans the basic respect of giving them a straight answer about their own money?
Well, members, a point of order is noted at 1:52. The Premier has the call.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I reject all of the false and misleading preface elements that preceded the question. And we have provided a direct answer about our understanding of the current state of the province's finances. We've seen a massive decline in revenues. And the government has also acted with unprecedented scale to keep our economy on life support with $14 billion of fiscal action, both direct payments, grants to small businesses, to people who had to self-isolate, deferrals on utility bills, on business taxes, on property taxes, Mr. Speaker. This has massively affected our fiscal situation, as will become evident in August.
Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not done when it comes to reporting to Albertans on their money. Premier wants to hand Alberta teachers' pensions over to AIMCO, even though the managers there lost billions upon billions of Alberta's taxpayers' money. Now, there's a report that shows just how badly AIMCO has mismanaged the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and by law, that should have been made public on June 30th. I guess they forgot to rewrite that law. Why is this Premier illegally withholding the truth of AIMCO's incompetence from Albertans? It's their money after all. Release the report.
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the Leader of the NDP is not fully aware of the fact that we have been through the largest public health crisis in over a century, which caused a number of normal government functions and operations to be suspended and delayed as the public service was generally unable to work in their offices and were refocused on matters of urgent priorities. And I understand that is one reason why the Heritage and Savings Trust Fund report was not filed on June 30. I understand it's expected to be filed in the next week or so. And I would ask the Leader of the NDP to please give some consideration to our public servants who've been working around the clock to cope with this massive workload in the past 4 months.
The Leader of the Official Opposition for her second set of questions.
That's rich. Alberta families are struggling because this Premier increased their income taxes, their property taxes, their school fees, their tuition costs, their insurance costs, and even their camping fees to pay for his $4.7 billion corporate handout. Some parents then made the difficult choice to spend less time with their kids in order to earn some overtime and make ends meet. Now this Premier is taking that overtime away from them. They'll either have to spend more time away from home or take another step closer to poverty. So to the Premier, not the Minister of Labour, but the Premier, why is he so hostile to working Alberta families?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, questions like that, loaded with falsehoods that completely contradict reality. Sounds like it's written for like a grade 10 high school debate competition, Mr. Speaker. We support working people, which is why, for example, Mr. Speaker, in the legislation we tabled this week, we will give working people the ability to determine whether or not their forced union dues will be directed to political campaigns, which they find offensive, Mr. Speaker. While the Leader of the NDP stands with the union bosses, we stand with ordinary union members.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, what working people want is for this government to get their hands out of their pockets. Now, the boss can force a working parent to take a double shift without any overtime pay, and yes, that's in your bill, but that's not all. The Premier has also removed the need for notice before a temporary layoff. In this volatile economy, a working parent could lose 2 weeks of pay once, twice, 3 times, or more in a year. That could be a 12% pay cut. That's a ticket to poverty. Why won't the Premier admit his bill is an attack on more than 400,000 non-unionized Alberta workers?
The Honourable the Premier.
So let me be absolutely clear. What the Leader of the NDP said is completely, categorically, objectively false, completely false. There is no elimination of overtime pay in the provisions in this bill, and it is time for the NDP, Mr. Speaker, to stop trying to deceive Albertans as they do in this place every day. The bill is clear. It's black on white on the paper, Mr. Speaker. There is no elimination of overtime pay. It is completely false.
Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, I know it's not the case that the Premier is lying, so he clearly doesn't understand the legislation he just introduced, and I'll walk him through it anytime. Let's meet. I'll explain it to you. You desperately need it. Now, yesterday, we asked the government why they're permitting bosses to wait a month to pay out wages when people have been fired. Newsflash, half of Alberta's working families have $200 or less at the end of the month. The minister's so-called simple change in timing pushes those families into crisis and poverty. How can this Premier be so tone-deaf and so divorced from the reality of working families in Alberta? 60% of them, Mr. Speaker.
Well, the Premier.
We know what the NDP did to working families, to poor families. They imposed a carbon tax, which made everything more expensive. Boy, she's angry again today, Mr. Speaker. She just accused me of lying again. Yesterday, the NDP leader said that I was lying by asserting that Unifor was opposed to the pipelines. But, Mr. Speaker, Unifor says pipeline expansion is short-sighted. Unifor files evidence against Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. Pipeline exporting crude isn't good for Canada, Unifor. Unifor files for judicial review to stop Northern Gateway. Unifor welcomes the demise of the Keystone XL raw export pipeline. All of these news releases from Unifor.
Honourable the Leader of Order. The Leader of the Opposition has another opportunity to ask a question right now. I encourage her to do so. Clearview, then.
Mr. Speaker, we were pleased to see the Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity announcing the new Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program and continuing the NDP legacy in attracting investment in the petchem sector. But the government's plan will attract less than half of the private sector investments and create thousands of fewer jobs than our plan. Alberta was on track to be a global leader in petrochemicals under the NDP. Minister, why are you sending billions of dollars of investment to the U.S.?
The Honourable the Associate Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity.
Mr. Speaker, it feels like Christmas when the NDP caucus asks me 2 questions in the same year. So, just to be clear, Mr. Speaker, and I can appreciate that the honourable member on the other side suffers from a bit of revisionist history. However, the actual PDP program began under the PC government in 2014. And so this is just a continuation of our investment in the petrochemical industry. This program is about economic stimulus, it is about economic recovery, and it is about jobs.
Well, member for Edmonton Beverly Clearview.
Mr. Speaker, when the NDP brought in the petrochemical incentives, the UCP, not only once, not twice, many times over and over voted against our program. They also cried that grants were too risky. Now their program is just that, it's grants. The hypocrisy coming from the other side is unbelievable, Mr. Speaker. Minister, why the flip-flop?
Honourable the Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity.
honourable member is looking for sound bites on his Twitter account, but I can tell you there will be no victory laps on this question, Mr. Speaker, because the original PDP program began in 2014 under the PC government. Mr. Speaker, it's true that giving out grants early on is something that is of concern to us because it puts taxpayers at risk. That's why this program, we will not give out a single grant, Mr. Speaker, until that facility is built. We're talking about a $5–10 billion facility. We're talking thousands of jobs. Then we hand out the grant money. No risk to the consumer, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton Beverly Clareview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that the UCP government inherited from the former PCs is their arrogance. At today's press conference, we learned that the new petrochemical program is still not ready. But the minister's been on the job for 15 months. 15 months, Minister, and your homework is still not done. Other than costing Albertans hundreds of thousands of dollars for the one job you've created, what were you doing all this time?
Order. The honourable minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member has me at a disadvantage because he is not encumbered by the truth like we are on this side. So, Mr. Speaker, I can say absolutely we have been going hard on this file since April of last year. As you recall, in 2019, we announced PDP2, which was a continuation of the PDP1 developed by the PC government, and we believe in this program, and it's a good program, Mr. Speaker, but we wanted to make it better. So we collaborated with industry. We got some advice from industry. We solicited their feedback, and yes, Mr. Speaker, we made a good program better.
Wow. Order. The honourable member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday it was revealed that the hailstorm that devastated northeast Calgary caused $1.2 billion in damage, making it the costliest hailstorm in Canadian history. More than 70,000 homes and vehicles were damaged or destroyed. Premier only promised relief for overland flooding, but in case Premier didn't notice, this was a hailstorm. Will the Premier provide relief to people of northeast Calgary and cover hail damage?
The honourable Premier has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, as the member knows, the government, further to the advice of the scientists at the Emergency Management Agency, declared the hailstorm that affected northeast Calgary, Airdrie, and other communities to be a disaster, qualifying for support through the Alberta Disaster Recovery Program. And so we are working with the affected municipalities to ensure that that funding flows to support affected infrastructure. I'm also pleased to say that according to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, $1.2 billion of payments are being made by insurance companies, even though the NDP said they were refusing to make payments on those policies.
The honourable, the member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier likes to claim that providing relief for hail damage is somehow bailing out insurance companies, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Covering hail damage would be helping people, not the Premier's insurance lobbyist friends. Will the Premier immediately address this gap between private insurance coverage and support available through the Disaster Recovery Program so that nobody falls through the cracks?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if we apply the member's standard consistently, then why did the NDP allow tens of thousands of Albertans who suffered from 30-some hailstorms during the tenure of the NDP government to receive precisely zero disaster assistance support? Mr. Speaker, in this instance, the Disaster Recovery Program will provide support for homeowners who suffered surface flooding, which is an uninsurable element of a disaster. And I am pleased to report that, according to the Insurance Bureau, some 70,000 claims are being processed at a value of $1.2 billion in addition to the public support.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a time like this, we believe the government should have the backs of people suffering from a natural disaster. Nothing could have been done to prevent the northeast hailstorm, and people continue to suffer due to this government's lack of action. The government was there for Albertans during the 2013 Calgary floods, the 2016 Fort McMurray fire, and the floods in Fort Mac this year. What is so different about people of northeast Calgary that the Premier refuses to help them?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, this government is applying exactly the same law and policy for the Disaster Recovery Program that the NDP had, that previous governments had before that. which provides government support for damage caused for uninsurable damage. So he refers to the 2013 flood. That was surface flooding, Mr. Speaker, for which insurance products cannot generally be purchased, whereas hail damage is a standard part of both auto and housing insurance packages, being reflected in the $1.2 billion of policies being paid out.
The honourable member for Calgary Klein has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP talk about reforms that they made to election financing in Alberta. And yes, it's true, through bipartisan effort, the legislature enacted reforms to ban direct donations from unions and corporations to political parties. But let's be clear, the NDP weren't exactly altruistic here. They made sure that there was still a way for their friend Gil McGowan, Commissar of the Alberta Federation of Labour, to support the political efforts. To the Premier, can you confirm that we will follow through on our campaign promise to close the loophole of the AFL?
The Honourable the Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we have a campaign platform commitment which will be reflected in amendments to the Election Financing Contribution Disclosure Act, I believe later this year, to close the gaping loophole created by the NDP, which allows the NDP, through its legal constitutional affiliate, the Alberta Federation of Labour, to spend millions of dollars, unlimited dollars, on NDP campaigns. And we know why the NDP, the leader of the NDP, is so sensitive about anti-pipeline Unifor, Mr. Speaker, because here I have social media postings of Unifor campaigning for the NDP in the last election.
The honourable member for Calgary Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, given that it's not just an AFL loophole allowing the NDP affiliates to spend millions to support their partisan efforts, that is a problem. And given that the NDP still allowed their union bosses to contribute unlimited amounts to their third-party advertisers, and given that in the last election we also promised Albertans that we would take big union money out of politics by putting a cap on allowable donations to third-party advertisers, to the Premier, can you also confirm that you are working on keeping the promise to keep dark money out of politics?
The Honourable the Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that is one of the reasons why we will also, in addition to closing the loophole that allows a formal legal affiliate of the NDP. By the way, Mr. McGowan has a seat on the board of the NDP. Mr. McGowan, who, by the way, has opposed every single pipeline contrary to the interests of his members, and who is a former NDP candidate, took $1.8 million of forced union dues to spend it on supporting the NDP, a massive violation of the spirit of the law, and that's one of the reasons we'll also put a $30,000 cap on contributions to PACs.
The honourable member for Calgary Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier for his efforts and the answer. Given that the AFL and the NDP union bosses not only dumped millions of dollars into political activities supporting the NDP, but given that in large part of these dollars came from dues of union members who were not asked for their consent, and given that every union member should have the right to opt out of supporting political causes that they don't agree with, to the Premier, can you explain to this House why it is so important to give union members a choice on whether their union dues go towards political activities?
Good question. The Honourable the Premier.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And Bill 32 keeps another platform commitment to empower ordinary union members with a opt-in provision to let them indicate whether or not they want freely, of their own free will, to finance certain political campaigns. I'll give you an example. The Alberta Federation of Labour, under Mr. McGowan's NDP leadership, Mr. Speaker, has opposed every single major pipeline, TMX, KXL, Northern Gateway, Energy East, and I think his members have every right to say they will not fund campaigns to oppose their own jobs and will empower them that way.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Folks in Edmonton are worried, and rightly so. The Misericordia Hospital is in a full facility COVID-19 outbreak. 3 patients are dead, 20 patients are infected, and 15 of our healthcare heroes are in harm's way. The AHS Edmonton Zone Medical Director, Dr. Zygun, put it best when he said, everybody appreciates that this is a very challenging situation. To the Minister of Health, we are seeing leadership from AHS, and we should be proud of our frontline healthcare workers. Can you share with the House the leadership steps you're taking to address the situation at the Misericordia, and please be specific?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Misericordia Hospital is now closed to new patients due to the ongoing transmission, and no new patients will be admitted to the hospital, and day procedures and visits will be postponed and rescheduled to other sites in Edmonton and area. And Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the pandemic, we provided AHS, and through which Covenant is funded as well. With surge funding, we continue to provide whatever resources that Covenant and AHS require, as well as our public health officials, to increase our capacity for our testing, to increase our workforce capacity for our contact tracing, so that we can make sure we can react as quickly as we can to the pandemic.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that Dr. Zygon reassured the public and said that all the other zone hospitals had come together to ensure patient care is continued for Edmontonians, and given that Edmontonians are fortunate to live in a major city with other hospitals where there is system redundancy, but given that not all Albertans are that fortunate because some live in rural areas with a single hospital, and given that many Albertans have started reaching out to ask what the plan is if their remote hospital needs to be shut down because of COVID-19. To the Minister, what is your plan for emergency hospital care if a remote hospital has to shut down, and would you be willing to share that plan publicly?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I expect the integrated system in the Edmonton zone, as well as all the other 4 zones throughout the province, to be able to react as what happened here in Edmonton as well. Mr. Speaker, on an ongoing basis, because we're going to be living with COVID for quite a while. And Mr. Speaker, the plan is we have 100 hospitals, including our 16 largest facilities, so that each of them can help the others as we need to react to COVID on an ongoing basis, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to listen to the medical advice that we receive from our medical professionals, Mr. Speaker, as we continue to respond to
the Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Special Select Public Health Act Review Committee is meant to look at the COVID-19 pandemic response along with the Public Health Act and provide recommendations to improve that act in light of the lessons we have learned, and given that the Minister of Health has played a central role in the pandemic response, and given that other health leaders like Dr. Zygon have also played a key role, as we're seeing publicly in the last few days, and have direct knowledge of how this act is working for Albertans, will the Minister agree to come before the Select Special Standing Committee, and will he make his tireless zone lead medical officers of health also available for oral testimony at the committee?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we answered this question yesterday, and it's the same answer today. The Special Select Committee was directed by this legislature to do its work to review the Public Health Act, a piece of legislation that is as old as this province, older than this province, Mr. Speaker, at least some of those pieces of legislation. And look, the NDP are unfortunately using this as an opportunity to politicize the response to COVID-19. I would ask the NDP again to take the direction of this legislature seriously, get to work. The name of the committee itself is to review the Public Health Act, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This UCP government refuses to engage with the tens of thousands of Albertans who've written in worried about changes made to their pensions in this Premier's surprise attack on the CPP. Members of the UCP are so afraid of these issues that they have repeatedly voted against having any real debate here, even though they would control the outcome. Even yesterday, the Premier refused to answer my questions about responding to those who've made their voices heard. Well, Mr. Speaker, today I dropped off over 36,000 written submissions at the Premier's office. Will he be reading them, and will he respond to them?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member is in the Alberta Legislature where we debate issues like this. Yesterday there was an opportunity within this chamber to debate her private member's bill and the decisions that were made by the private member's bill committee. All that had to happen was one member of the official opposition had to indicate that they wanted to have that debate, Mr. Speaker. Interestingly enough, not one member of the NDP could be bothered to stand up to ask for that debate, Mr. Speaker. So I think it's rich saying that they want to have a debate about that issue when they can't be bothered to even show up for work to ask for the debate, Mr. Speaker. Our side of the House is always happy to debate legislation inside the chamber.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, I, as one member, did indicate and requested unanimous consent so that this debate could happen, and the members opposite gleefully voted against that. Given that this Premier's attacks on pensions are driven by more than his decades-long vendetta against the Canada Pension Plan rather than the facts about what is best for Albertans, and given that his colleagues in the UCP were eager to ignore the tens of thousands of Albertans who signed the petition at handsoffmycpp.ca to the Premier, who exactly are you representing when you attack the CPP? Will you finally admit your assault on Alberta's retirements is part of your agenda?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the issue is you can't come to work late. When you come to work late and you ask to then go back and do a process that was scheduled earlier, that is inefficient, certainly for the legislature, Mr. Speaker, and disappointing. I know my constituents expect me to be at work on time, and I'm sure they do of the NDP. That's similar to one of my children coming to me, Mr. Speaker, and saying, my teacher gave me a bad mark because I put my assignment in late, Mr. Speaker. That's disappointing, Mr. Speaker. We have a process inside this chamber, Mr. Speaker. It's disappointing the NDP could not be bothered to participate in that process. And if I was their constituents and one of the signers of those petitions, I would be very disappointed in the NDP's failure.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Millwood.
36,000 Albertans are disappointed in this government. Given that the UCP keeps centralizing more and more of Albertans' pension assets under the AIMCO umbrella, and given that the Premier continues to muse about a referendum that would take Albertans out of the safety of the Canada Pension Plan, and given that this government continues to try and hide from Albertans the full extent of AIMCO's recent massive failures and losses to the Premier, when you finally sit down to write the unwanted referendum question about your pension scheme, will you explain to Albertans the immense risk you're subjecting their retirement funds to by entrusting more money to AIMCO?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite, I know she takes great pleasure in trying to scare people about their pensions, but let's hear the facts. Alberta CPP contributors send $3 billion a year net to pension beneficiaries in Eastern and Central Canada. Money that belongs to Albertans that we could keep here to reduce premiums or increase benefits. Now, I know that the member opposite has a very low view of the capacity of Albertans to manage their own money. I have a much higher view. I think Albertans have every bit as much capacity to manage their money as people on Bay Street do.
The Honourable Member for Banff-Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In last year's election, our party campaigned on a promise to restore balance to Alberta's labour laws. We did this because Albertans were sick and tired of watching the NDP reward their union friends at the expense of workers' rights. That's why we made a key platform commitment to protect workers from being forced to fund political parties and causes without explicit opt-in approval. So to the Premier, how does Bill 32 ensure that workers of Alberta will no longer be forced to subsidize political campaigns without their approval?
Honourable the Premier has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I raised the case of a potential Jewish union member being forced to fund advocacy to attack the Jewish homeland, the state of Israel. And the leader of the NDP got out of her seat and started yelling at me. She was so upset that we were shining a spotlight on the unfairness. Mr. Speaker, I want to quote my friend Shimon Fogel, CEO of the Center for Jewish Affairs. It is appalling that Unifor has allowed itself to be drawn into the anti-Semitic, divisive BDS campaign against Israel. Mr. Speaker, Bill 32 will allow Unifor members who support Israel no longer to be forced into that anti-Semitic campaign.
The Honourable Member for Banff-Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier. Well, given that national unions and NDP affiliates like the AFL use their workers' dues to actively campaign against the best interest of Albertans, and given that Unifor, a friend of the NDP, launched a lawsuit against the Northern Gateway Pipeline despite representing Northern Albertan oil sands workers, can the Premier please explain how Bill 32 will prevent NDP-affiliated unions from forcing workers to pay for lawsuits and campaigns that are counter to the economic interests of Albertans?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the NDP leader said that I was, quote, lying. She said, because I know personally and worked at various times with Unifor, who were incredibly supportive of TMX and other pipelines. So let me read the following headlines from the Unifor website. Unifor says pipeline expansion, short-sighted. Unifor files against Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. Pipeline exporting crude is not good for Canada. Unifor files for judicial review to stop Northern Gateway. Unifor welcomes demise of the Keystone XL raw export pipeline. Unifor leader, Mr. Speaker, who stood in a rally with Jane Fonda and David Suzuki to call for no more pipelines. Alberta union members should not have to pay for that.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the Premier. Well, given that our province is facing an unprecedented economic crisis due to the COVID-19, and given that the rebounding of Alberta's oil industry is vital to the economic recovery, not just of our province, but of our entire country, and given that the ANFL president and founder of the NDP, Gil McGowan, has actively opposed Keystone XL, Energy East, TMX, Northern Gateway, and the Alberta Clipper, again to the Premier, how will Bill 32 put an end to oil sands workers being forced to pay for anti-oil sands campaigns?
Premier.
Once Bill 32 becomes law, they'll simply be able to refuse to tick off a box to send old Gil money to campaign against their jobs. The same Gil McGowan, a former NDP candidate, a member of the NDP board, and a president of a legal affiliate of the NDP, recently referred to parents who send their kids to faith-based schools as, I quote, religious nut bars. Mr. Speaker, imagine being the Sikh parent of kids who go to a Sikh school, Muslim parent of kids who go to an Islamic school, or heaven forbid, Christian parents whose kids go to a Christian school, and have it being forced to fund advocacy that calls you a nut bar. We're going to let those people withhold the political dues to Gil McGowan in the future.
The honourable member for Calgary Buffalo has a question.
Thank you. When it comes to supporting small businesses, this government has failed badly. The economic plan they announced last week was nothing more than a warmed-over version of their failed $4.7 billion corporate handout, which, in addition to not creating a single job, absolutely has done nothing to support small businesses. Calgary businesses have been hard hit by this pandemic and economic crisis, and they're asking this government for help, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister of Economic Development and Trade explain why, at a time when Calgary small businesses are struggling to hold on, this minister can only offer failed policies from the past?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage the member opposite to do his homework. He may not be aware that our government recently introduced a small and medium enterprise business grant to support small businesses as they relaunch. The small business grant gives up to $5,000 for businesses to spend where they know is best, whether that's rent, inventory, wages for employees. This is in addition to all of the other measures our government has introduced from the early days of the pandemic, the deferrals, the supports, the participation in the federal secret program, and so much more.
Good job, Minister.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
Small businesses are hurting, given that the sales across this province have plummeted by 30% since March, a $2 billion loss, Mr. Speaker, and given that many businesses are reporting that they're likely to close in the coming weeks. But given that this government is more focused on supporting big, profitable companies run by their rich friends and insiders and seem to be perfectly fine with leaving small businesses to fend, for the most part, for themselves. To the Minister, your economic plan has failed. You're giving money to corporations, has done nothing to support small businesses. What more are you going to do?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say, I mean, after over a year in this House, it still blows my mind that the members opposite take zero accountability or even acknowledge the fact that they drove out billions of dollars of investment, caused thousands of job losses, no accountability for it under their NDP socialist regime. And now they're going to preach to us about supporting businesses, something we've done from day one. Again, $5,000 small and medium enterprise business grant. Do your homework.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you. Given that this government and minister has been dragged kicking and screaming into doing anything for small businesses, and given that the Calgary small businesses will need more than deferrals and failed corporate handouts to emerge from this pandemic, and given that only 13% of restaurants expect to be profitable within 6 months and many could be doomed without more support from this government, can the minister clarify when will small businesses receive more support? Or is she stalling because she's waiting for Justin Trudeau to pick up the ball again?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish the member opposite, give me a hard question. This is too easy. Give me something hard. Once again, up to $5,000 grant that has already been introduced. I wish the member opposite would do his homework. I don't know what more to expect from the worst finance minister ever.
Minister for Status of Women how she's been advocating for women to be included in the province's economic recovery. Her answer, in a nutshell, we're supporting male-dominated industries which will somehow trickle down and help women. Not only is this offensive, it sends the message that jobs for women aren't a priority for this UCP government. So I want to give that minister another chance. How are you ensuring that women's needs are centered in economic recovery plans? And a lot of women are watching, so please, I beg you, answer the question.
Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for Economic Trade, Development and Tourism, a very strong woman who has put together with the Premier our economic recovery plan. And again, maybe a little bit of homework is required to understand the incredible amount of work that's been put in this that is going to help out everybody right across the spectrum. But if you want to understand why disproportionately women are being impacted, that member is going to have to look back to her own policies that desperately impacted women at a disproportionate level while her members were in government.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Given that countless women have reached out to me and my colleagues to say that it's absolutely critical that issues that predominantly impact women be elevated in this legislature, given that earlier this week, this government introduced Bill 32, which attacks protections like parental leave, job-protected leave, both of which allowed so many women to enter the workforce in the first place. So again, to that same minister, what are you doing specifically to help ensure that the labour protections so hard fought for, won by so many people before us, are not eroded by your legislation?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I find very interesting about that comment is actually this legislation will protect women who have not been allowed to vote, without having union thugs looking over their shoulders, watching everything that they're doing. We're actually liberating their ability to make their decisions on their own and actually put their dollars where they'd like to put them without being forced to use their dollars to fund campaigns that they might not actually believe in. And I'm so curious to see if this member is willing to stand up and speak out if we're going to talk about empowering women. Why hasn't she spoken out against the member from Edmonton Whiteman who actually used language against one of our female members that was disgusting?
Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Given that we're not getting anywhere with this minister, so I'll try another. We know that thousands of families are being impacted by the changes to the child and family benefit, and that single parents, particularly single mothers, will be hardest hit. And given that yesterday a single mother of 2 kids reached out to me to say that she's learned that she's lost this benefit and she doesn't know how she's going to make ends meet, can the Minister of Children's Services explain to us how cutting financial supports for young families is going to help our province recover? And can she tell me what I should say to that mom and to all the parents who are left in limbo due to her government's cuts?
The Honourable, the Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier this week, the Alberta Child and Family Benefit will now give more support to approximately 65,000 very low-income families across this province. By consolidating this benefit, we're putting more money in the pockets of those most in need and spending less on administration. We're also reviewing our approach to affordable childcare to make sure that we can direct the supports at a time like this to get parents in need back to work.
Hear, hear. Member for Airdrie Cochrane has a question.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta union bosses are angry right now because we are giving the power back to its members where it belongs. Unifor, for example, launched a lawsuit against the Northern Gateway pipeline despite representing oil sands workers. And AFL President Gil McGowan opposed Keystone XL, Energy East, TMX, Northern Gateway, and the Alberta Clipper, despite representing union workers who would be employed on these projects. Can the Premier explain how Bill 32 will redirect union leaders from protesting oil and gas when they're supposed to be representing their members in industry?
Hear, hear. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, these are, that's a very good question. These are big national unions. And I think what's happened is that the hard left down east has taken control of some of these unions, and they don't care. They don't care about the jobs, the livelihoods, or the way of life of Western Unifor and union members who work in the oil and gas industry. And so we are going to empower those individual Alberta union members to say no to Jerry Diaz, to say no to big labour, to say yes to their own jobs, to say yes to oil and gas, to say yes to Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Airdrie Cochrane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Premier. Given that many workers who are unionized in rural Alberta have a spouse that work in the oil and gas industry, and given that many union organizations will use union dues to protest the oil and gas sector, And given that their members rely on these industries to put food on their table, pay their taxes, and even pay their union dues. Once again to the Premier, how will Bill 32 give union members a say on where their dues will go?
The Premier.
Speaker, through a opt-in provision. So in the future, Jerry Diaz and the union bosses down east won't be able to take millions of dollars from Alberta union members to spend it on anti-oil and gas campaigns. They'll have to ask for their permission first. And you know what this might create, Mr. Speaker? Accountability. That's why the NDP is so ferociously against it. The NDP leader boasted about campaigning with Unifor on pipelines, Mr. Speaker. The Unifor openly, publicly, explicitly is opposed to every pipeline. We're going to empower their members to say no to that nonsense in Alberta.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Premier. Given that the NDP and the AFL are one and the same as Gil McGowan sits on their provincial board, and given that their union members contribute hard-earned wages to the AFL every year, and given that not all union members are NDP supporters, to the Premier, do you think it is fair that non-political people have to support a political campaign or others are forced to donate to political organizations that they do not align with?
The Premier has the call.
Good question. Mr. Speaker, let me just say this. We respect the right of collective bargaining, and I fully appreciate that there are many union members who support the NDP. There may even be some who belong to and contribute to the NDP, and they have every democratic right to do so. But for those conservative or liberal or nonpartisan supporters in those unions, they should not be forced to fund a political agenda with which they disagree, particularly when it is against their own personal economic and financial interests. The AFL spent $1.8 million supporting the NDP in the last 2 years and opposed every pipeline. That's a shame, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton West Henday.
Last December, this government removed the 5% insurance cap, knowing full well that the insurance industry is making hundreds of millions more in premiums than they are paying out in claims. The minister said that the cap was only a Band-Aid solution. Well, Minister, when you removed that Band-Aid, Albertans hemorrhaged more money to these already profitable insurance companies with a 30% increase to their premiums in some cases. Will this government stop putting the profitability of large companies ahead of the bank accounts of Albertans and reinstate the insurance cap now?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is addressing the issues in the automobile insurance industry that the previous government wasn't willing to do. Mr. Speaker, frankly, the previous government didn't want to do the work to fix the problem, and we aren't going to ignore this. The Expert Advisory Committee is finalizing their report. We continue to be committed to making the necessary changes to ensure that Albertans have automobile insurance that is affordable, accessible, and sustainable.
Edmonton West Henday.
Well, given that the minister created a panel to address skyrocketing insurance rates, a problem that this UCP government created by removing the insurance cap, and given that this panel is considering a move to no-fault insurance, and given that no-fault insurance will only benefit the bottom line of insurance companies by removing the opportunity for Albertans to get fair compensation when they are injured, to the minister, will you do what's right by Albertans and promise that Alberta will not move to a no-fault insurance system no matter what your hand-picked panel recommends?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, a problem that we inherited from that previous government that, don't worry, we'll fix it. We're working on it. Out of the $2.7 million in insured vehicles, 53% had more than a 5% increase during the 5% rate cap. The rate increase limitation was a Band-Aid on the problem that made a bad situation worse. The rate cap did not deal with the underlying issues that were driving up insurance premium. Once again, don't expect the members opposite to know how to fix a problem. They know how to create one. We've got it under control.
The honourable member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given the Premier's friends in the insurance industry are calling for no-fault insurance with the option to purchase tort, the right for an individual to sue, and given that creating a no-fault insurance system with the option to upgrade a policy to have tort will be creating a system that will remove a right that all Albertans currently have and give it back to only those able to pay for it, to the minister, will you commit to not allowing insurance companies to sell tort, or are you going to allow these companies to commodify our legal rights just so that they can make more profit on the backs of Albertans?
The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we will do is commit to fixing their mess. Again, the previous government didn't want to do the work to fix the problem. We're not going to ignore this. We will fix it. The Expert Advisory Committee is finalizing their report, and again, we continue to be committed to making the necessary changes to ensure that Albertans have automobile insurance that is, again, affordable, accessible, and sustainable. We have the backs of Albertans.
Member for Edmonton Whitemud has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the government for realizing their mistake and finally acknowledging the needs of Southwest Edmonton. The expansion of Terwilliger Drive will benefit the constituents of Edmonton Whitemud. Our government recognized it, and after first cancelling provincial support for the project, the UCP finally has as well. As one of the fastest growing areas of the province, Southwest Edmonton needs infrastructure, and yet the UCP has delayed the timeline for the badly needed South Edmonton Hospital by 5 years. Now that the Minister of Infrastructure has acknowledged he was wrong about Terwilliger Drive, will he commit to building the South Edmonton Hospital on the timeline that our government committed to?
The Honourable the Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was so proud to finally work with this government to deliver what the people of Southwest have been waiting for 40 years. Mr. Speaker, the NDP presided over this particular province for the last 4 years before we booted them out of office. They had that particular problem and they did nothing. I am glad that this government finally answered the call of my residents in Southwest.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you. Given that the UCP has been slow to respond to the needs of Edmonton, and given that the Mayor of Edmonton has expressed concerns about the other city priority projects this government has ignored, and given that if the UCP is standing by their delayed timeline of the South Edmonton Hospital, my constituents are rightly concerned about what this means for other vitally needed infrastructure. To the Minister of Infrastructure, when specifically will you deliver on the other priority needs of the City of Edmonton?
The Honourable the Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that this government has committed more money to infrastructure in our capital region than the NDP did in the 4 years that they were in office. Mr. Speaker, you know what they did? What they did was introduce a carbon tax that decimated our communities and businesses, something that nobody asked for. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the aisle, we are taking steps to deal with the problems that the people of Edmonton and Alberta care for.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the UCP delayed the timeline for the South Edmonton Hospital, what I have been asking about for 5 years, a hospital that would serve the people of Edmonton Whitemud and many other constituencies, including those from the riding of the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and given that they are doubling down on their failed corporate handout that has not created a single job or added a single dollar in investment in Alberta, what will it take for this government to realize that building this critical hospital for the constituents of South Edmonton is a better economic strategy than doubling down on their failed $4.7 billion corporate handout?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can advise the people of Edmonton that our government continues to do its planning towards getting a hospital in South Edmonton, as well as a bunch of other infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. Our government is committed to more infrastructure spending, I think, than the NDP ever did in their 4 years, in particular as part of our response to our stimulus plan as we relaunch the economy here in Alberta and we continue to respond to the pandemic and relaunching our economy here in Alberta, Mr. Speaker. And part of that is going to be a significant amount of infrastructure spending in Edmonton as well as in the health system.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our UCP government has come out with a bill that not only protects workers' rights, but that also dismisses the NDP's union buddies from being able to disregard the will of their members and spend workers' union dues to campaign for the NDP. While we uphold ourselves to making legislation more democratic, the NDP false narratives about how we are destroying their union comrades when, in fact, we are making them more accountable to hard-working Albertans. To the Premier, do these changes brought about by Bill 32 make it any harder for employees to join unions?
The Honourable the Premier.
Absolutely not. In fact, Bill 2 last year, Mr. Speaker, restored workplace democracy that had been destroyed by the NDP. They went to what's called automatic carding, which meant that people could be intimidated and harassed into signing a card publicly. We brought back the secret ballot vote. And Mr. Speaker, I think I know why they're so sensitive about this, because I've got here a list of about 25 unions that contributed $4.8 million to pro-NDP political campaigns in the past 3 years alone. Now these members will get to decide instead of just the union bosses.
The honourable member for Calgary-Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that union bosses such as Gil McGowan, who aren't interested in creating jobs for workers, since he has opposed every pipeline project despite the thousands of good-paying union jobs, and given that Gil has shown his true colors, opposing individual rights such as the choice in education, calling parents who send their kids to charter schools religious nut bars. To the Premier, what thoughts might you have about NDP union cronies such as Gil McGowan that constantly oppose job creation and freedoms for Albertans?
Right.
Honourable the Premier.
I want to come back to what I said earlier. Just to imagine, Mr. Speaker, you're a parent, hardworking, a member of an Alberta union. You make the sacrifices to pay tuition to send your kid to a faith-based school because you want your children to be raised with an awareness of your family's values and heritage. And then the guy that you pay these dues to, he calls you a, quotes, religious nut bar, and says that the independent or charter school you send your kid to should be defunded. Mr. Speaker, I can only imagine how offensive that is to such a family. We'll empower that family now to say no to Mr. Gowan's politics of hate.
The honourable member for Calgary-Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that CUPE is an organization with a political left agenda, in fact, they are a founding partner in the NDP, they have been actively campaigning and taking sides in elections across this country, and given that CUPE endorses the illegitimate election that returned Venezuela's dictator to power, a dictator whose regime murders, imprisons, and starves its own people, and further, given that these are the types of political campaigns that union members pay without their own choice, again, to the Premier, how can we ensure that union members have a choice as to where their union dues are being used?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, the NDP board member, Gil McGowan, referred to families of faith as, quotes, religious nut bars, promoting hatred against them. The Unifor participated in what the Center for Jewish Affairs called an anti-Semitic and divisive campaign against Israel. CUPE, Mr. Speaker, has supported the vicious and murderous socialist dictatorship of Venezuela, Mr. Speaker, and we have their refugees being forced to pay their union dues and salaries. It's all wrong, and we will now empower those good working union members to say no to the politics of hate.
Honourable members, in 30 seconds or less, we will return to the daily routine. You to exit the chamber expeditiously.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions.
The Honourable, the official opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give notice at the appropriate time. I'll be moving a motion pursuant to Standing Order 42. Would you like me to read it out? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning to propose the following motion. Be it resolved, the Legislative Assembly no longer has confidence in the Deputy Chair of Committee following his actions on July 8th, 2020.
Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Are there tablings? The Honourable, the member for Edmonton City Centre has a tabling, followed by the Minister of Service Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table 5 copies of a petition containing 543 signatures calling on the Government of Alberta to remove the overreaching powers given to the Premier, Ministers and any future governments regarding Bill 10. I have the requisite number of copies.
The Honourable Minister of Service Alberta has a tabling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I quoted from a supportive letter for Bill 28 signed by Alberta's Child Advocacy Centres. which was included in a letter I sent to all the provincial and territorial governments. Today I'm tabling the appropriate number of copies of those letters, both the ones signed by me and Saskatchewan's Ministers of Justice and Health, as well as the Child Advocacy Centre's letter.
Are there other cases? Member for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have the requisite number of copies of an email from a retired senior complaining about this government's approach on his pension plan. And I submit those in for the record for you.
Seeing none, the clerk.
Evenings to the clerk. Deferred divisions.
Honourable members, we are at points of order, and at approximately 1:53, a point of order was raised. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I rise on point of order for both 23H, I, and J, but also, Mr. Speaker, I think you will find that there have been other rulings from the chair in regards to the rule lie, and the rule, or sorry, not the rule lie, but the word lie being used inside the chamber. I refer specifically to the Leader of the Official Opposition in an exchange during the question exchange that took place at the point that I called the point of order. Mr. Speaker, I do not have the benefit of the blues, you will, but the statement that I was concerned about was something along the lines of this government is lying, or this government lies, or something along those lines. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have talked lots in the chamber over the last 15 months of the 30th legislature about the word lie, or about trying to say things about concerns about how we see mistruths with different sides of the aisle when there is a conversation. Certainly we all agree that we can't call another member a liar or refer to them as a liar. I will acknowledge that the Leader of the Official Opposition did not refer to the Premier specifically as a liar. She did say that the government is lying. However, the word lie has been found to be unparliamentary even when referring to a group, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that I understand that sometimes it is tough to express your concerns when you think the other side is not telling the truth. For example, when the other side lies about my constituents poisoning water when they're not. My constituents would really like it if I could point out that they're lying, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is that we cannot do that because we don't use that word. I have noticed that the Leader of the Official Opposition continues to use the word lie a lot. And I would like you, Mr. Speaker, to provide some advice to the chamber, Mr. Speaker, on where we are at when we are referring to the government as lying, or referring to the opposition as lying, the specific word lying, so that all members of the chamber can understand whether or not we are now allowed to use the word lie inside the chamber. Second, Mr. Speaker, I would also point out that the Leader of the Official Opposition was referring specifically to something that you had ruled on. You ruled on a point of privilege, which is a serious matter inside this chamber already in regards to exactly what the Leader of the Official Opposition accused the government and by way of, through the government, accused the Premier of lying about, Mr. Speaker. You have ruled that there was no point of privilege there, Mr. Speaker. Certainly when we have point of orders in this chamber and you've made a decision, that is the end of it in this chamber, and I think, Mr. Speaker, it is against our process and certainly will cause disorder inside this place for a member to continue to refer to something that the chair has already ruled on, Mr. Speaker, and I would ask that you provide some advice and caution on that.
The Honourable the Official Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is clearly a matter of dispute and not a point of order. I have the question that the Honourable Member, our Government House Leader, is referencing. The paragraph that I will look at is, last month the government rewrote the law to hide their year-end financials and then lied to the Assembly about it being the Auditor General's decision, referencing the government. I will also address the piece around the point of privilege ruling. That was specific to a point of privilege. It was not specific to whether or not there was a matter of dispute around whether or not the government actually did say that the Auditor General or the government made the decision around those financials. So although I appreciate the Government House Leader trying to say that the point of privilege should therefore mean that we should never discuss the Auditor General and the year-end financials, I think would be a pretty wide scope in regards to the fact that we still haven't actually seen the year-end financials, and in fact that the opposition has a right to ask on behalf of Albertans where the year-end financials are. In regards to the word lie, or lied, I think if we even just go through Hansard this afternoon through QP, the Premier used the word quite a few times. Members of the Cabinet have used the word quite a few times. Again, it is about the context. If we are going to rule it as a word that can no longer be used in this place, then we will have to look at both sides of the House, because very clearly, if we went through Hansard for the afternoon, we would see it was used multiple times by multiple members in this Assembly. So at this point, I do not see it as a point of order. I think it is just a matter of dispute.
Are there other submissions? Seeing none, I am prepared to rule on point of order. And both House leaders are correct that much has been said about the use of the word lie. And I think if there's one thing we can all agree upon, it is that the use of the word lie rarely creates good order under any context of which it being used. More often than not, the context in which it is being used in is a member trying to do indirectly what they can't do directly. On June 18th, just a little more than 1 year ago, 2019, I said these words. Here's what I will say. Let's all endeavor to raise the level of decorum and not imply that the government is lying, that individuals are lying. Let's do our very best to not try to do indirectly what we can't do directly, as my sense is that will continue to lower the level of decorum and not increase the level of debate. I'm not sure if I have said truer words in the Assembly as I did on June 18th. I will say them again today, encourage the Leader of the Official Opposition to find much more creative and helpful ways to debate in the Assembly, and I think in turn that will also allow the government to be more creative in just quoting other members inside the Assembly. I think that as we head into what may be a long number of weeks ahead of us, increased decorum will serve all of us and all of Albertans well. As such, I conclude this is not a point of order at this time, but in the strongest way possible, I encourage all members of the Assembly to consider the words they use and each in our own way increase decorum inside this Assembly. I consider this matter concluded. We are at points of correction. We are at orders of the day. Oh, I'm so sad. The Honourable, this matter is dealt with and concluded. We will now hear the request from the Honourable Official Opposition House Leader on a motion, Standing Order 42. I would remind the member that the requirement of a Standing Order 42 is that she speaks to the urgency of this matter and not the content of the motion, and I will endeavor to use the powers of the Speaker's chair to ensure that happens. Please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise pursuant to Standing Order 42 to request that the ordinary business of the Legislative Assembly be adjourned to debate a motion in regards to a matter that is urgent and pressing, specifically the following motion. Be it resolved the Legislative Assembly no longer have confidence in the Deputy Chair of Committees. Before I start, Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge that I take this very seriously. This is not something that any member of this chamber would like to do on a whim. Recognizing that I did have this role when I was part of the government and I was the Deputy Chair of Committees, and I recognize how being in the chair at different times can definitely be very stressful, and it is at times hard to maintain decorum in this place. In saying that, why do I find this urgent, Mr. Speaker? Well, first I'd like to acknowledge that pursuant to Standing Order 42, I have provided the members of the Assembly with the appropriate numbers of the copies. And further, while a motion under SO 42 requires no notice, my office did provide advance notice to the Speaker of my intention to introduce a motion under the appropriate standing order as per the Speaker's memo. This is important to acknowledge this, as in order for the functioning of this Assembly, rules and conventions are important. While those of us on the opposition side of the Assembly may disagree on policy and how best to create and implement policy and legislation, the great importance of our role dictates that all rights of the members of this Assembly are protected. The individuals in this Assembly who is responsible for that is the Speaker or the member in the role of the Speaker during debate and proceedings. I'd like to note that it is the responsibility of the Speaker to act as the guardian of the rights and privileges of members of the House as an institution, as stated on page 317 of Bosch and Gagnon 2017. So during the debate yesterday, there were a number of occurrences that occurred. Now, given the fact that this happened last night, and that this is our first opportunity to discuss this, speaking to the urgency of the matter of what occurred last night, and I will take your caution, Mr. Speaker, in regards to going into the details of that exchange last evening. I think that many members of this House will agree that the member from St. Albert who was debating Bill 30 had her rights within this Assembly breached by the Deputy Chair of Committees. Now, she was trying to express her feelings. She was interjected upon during that period of time, and in fact, due to that exchange, was asked to leave the chamber and was named. Those are very serious allegations to be made.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Instructions. The process for where we're at right now in the chamber is about the urgency, not debating the presence of the motion or the fact that the opposition may not have confidence in the Deputy Chair of Committees. That could happen if this debate is granted by this chamber, Mr. Speaker. With that said, further to that, if the honourable member feels that some privileges were breached by a member of this place, including the chair of committees, that would be a point of privilege, Mr. Speaker, and that member then would be able to respond, or somebody on their behalf, Mr. Speaker. I would, again, go to you, Mr. Speaker, for some explanation. This is urgency. That's what we should be discussing right now, and if this House decides to have a debate on the competence matter, then we'll see where we end up at that point.
Opposition House Leader, on the point of order.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think absolutely we need to speak to the moment of urgency. This happened last night. I am trying to get to why it is so urgent. I would think every member in this Assembly would want to know why this is so urgent. So I will follow your ruling, Mr. Speaker.
I did mention at the outset that I encourage you to speak to the urgency. It does sound to me like you're laying out a case about the position of whether or not the chair of committees, if the Assembly has the Assembly. But in saying that, I will provide a short period of time here for you to get back to the urgency of the issue, and then we will put the question.
Mr. Speaker, and I guess you're correct. It is hard when we speak of these issues specifically as it relates to this chamber around urgency, because typically we have a little bit of ability to have context when it relates to Albertans and how this matter is urgent to Albertans. So I will go to the reason that this is so urgent is it affects every single member in this chamber. It affects every single member from having the ability to stand in this House and to be able to feel freely without harassment to debate, with the intent of having the Speaker be a neutral, nonpartisan body. Because of that, this is urgent. This is urgent to every single member within this Assembly. Because how can we be in this chamber and be able to debate without knowing that the individual who is overseeing the debate, who is to be nonpartisan, who is to not interject, or to interject to ensure decorum remains in this House, when we had a demonstration last evening that may bring question into that? So it is urgent. Every single member in this House should see this as urgent, and there should be a conversation and a debate around how members in this chamber feel that they have the ability to continue to do their job effectively.
Well, members, Standing Order 42 is a request for unanimous consent, and that consent, if granted, will result in the discussion of the motion that is before the Assembly. So I will ask the question, all those in favor of granting unanimous consent to proceed to the standing order order 42, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. There's no reason to stand. There's no opportunity for a division. I understand that many of you have provided no requirement for unanimous consent. We are at orders of the day, orders du jour.
Under government bills and orders for third reading, Bill 28, Vital Statistics Protecting Albertans from Convicted Sex Offenders, Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Glubish.
The Honourable the Minister of Service Alberta has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand and move third reading of Bill 28, the Vital Statistics Protecting Albertans from Convicted Sex Offenders Amendment Act. The changes that we have proposed in this legislation will help to protect Albertans and their families in their own communities. When I heard that Saskatchewan was making changes to the eligibility of who can legally change their name in that province, I was quick to check on our own vital statistics legislation. And Mr. Speaker, I was shocked and disappointed to see that the same gap currently exists in Alberta. This must not be allowed to continue. Madam Speaker, survivors of sexual violence live with the effects of that trauma for the rest of their lives. And so I think it is common sense that we require their offenders to live under their own names. Albertans deserve to know who is living in their communities. They should feel safe and confident that their neighbor is not hiding from past convictions of sexual offenses. And the changes proposed in this bill will do just that. If this legislation can help protect one child, one family, one vulnerable Albertan from falling prey to a convicted sex offender, then this legislation will have been the greatest success. Madam Speaker, when we first spoke with Cheryl Diebel of Edmonton's Zebra Child Protection Centre in February, she was as surprised as we were that this loophole existed. At the time, she was unaware of any incidences of this happening with the people that organization serves and works with. But it took less than a week, Madam Speaker, for that to change. This is unacceptable. Since tabling this legislation, we have also heard about similar situations that happened here within Alberta. Again, this is unacceptable. We were honored to have Sheldon Kennedy of Respect Group with us when we announced this legislation, and he was here in the chamber when this bill was tabled alongside of the co-founder of Respect Group, Wayne McNeil. Sheldon's story is well known here in Alberta. Graham James, a convicted sex offender with a vile history, fled the country and was found to be coaching a sports team in Spain after his conviction. And then he fled again, hiding from his past, and was found in Mexico. He has since changed his name. This, Madam Speaker, is unacceptable. As government, our first duty is to protect public safety. We must do everything that we can. Take every step to protect children and vulnerable Albertans. Our government has already taken action legislatively last fall. My colleague, the Minister of Community and Social Services, tabled Clare's Law, which I'm pleased to say passed. That bill enables people at risk of domestic violence to obtain information on an intimate partner's history of domestic violence. Earlier this spring, my colleague, the Minister of Justice, tabled legislation to combat human trafficking, and again, I'm pleased to say that legislation passed. We have also set up a human trafficking task force led by Paul Brandt, who has been working to bring awareness to this issue of human trafficking and to combat it for many, many years. Madam Speaker, Bill 28 is another important step forward in protecting Albertans. When I first tabled this legislation on June 24th, I also invited all Canada's provinces and territories to join Saskatchewan and Alberta in implementing these strong protections to keep their families and communities safe. I was joined in that call by Saskatchewan's Ministers of Health and of Justice, and I'm pleased to say that our Premier has also committed to bringing this issue forward at the next Council of the Federation meeting, urging every Premier across this country to take similar action and implement these strong protections. Accompanying my letter was a letter from Alberta's child advocacy centres in which they say, and I quote, "As leaders in the field of child protection seeking to support the recovery of child and youth victims of crime, this legislation is imperative to provide protection to their well-being to ensure safety from their offender. By permitting convicted offenders to disguise their identities and past offenses, we increase possible re-victimization, jeopardize public safety, and unravel the advancement of work done to support the physical and emotional well-being of those impacted by sexual violence." End quote. That is what we're proposing to do with this legislation, Madam Speaker, and I hope that I can count on all members of this Assembly to consider the safety and protection of all Albertans and vote to pass this legislation. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to Bill 28 in third reading? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise this afternoon to speak to Bill 28 in third reading. I've spoken several times to this piece of legislation. I can say from the bottom of my heart that it's something that is important to ensure that sex offenders don't find a loophole in ways of changing their identity and hiding in the shadows here in the province of Alberta. And I thank the Minister from Service Alberta for bringing this legislation forward. And I think it's very important in terms of a step in order to ensure that there's another line of defense, another line of safety when it comes to information regarding accessing information of sex offenders. I know we've had some lengthy debate about this, and I think that some of the things that we've heard, I spoke to about yesterday about some of the misconceptions around potential victims of sexual assault being female only. I'd also heard yesterday some of the concerning comments that came from the Minister himself regarding the position of this piece of legislation from members of this side of the House. And I have to say that it was offensive to listen to him saying that we were opposing this. And I can say I paid attention quite closely to this debate, and at no point had I heard any member on this side of the House speak against this piece of legislation. There's several members on this side of the House that spent careers working, supporting survivors of sexual violence. And so for him to make those statements, it's concerning, it's misleading, and I'm not sure why those statements needed to occur. This is something that we have clearly indicated we support. What we have done is questioned next steps. Yeah. What else needs to happen? He listed several pieces of legislation that he, in government, was able to pass. He mentioned Clare's Law, he mentioned human trafficking, he mentioned the recent victims of crime, all of which this side of the House provided amendments which would enhance the legislation put forward, which would actually provide financial support and resources to survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. That is what we've been asking for. In those pieces of legislation that he was referencing that this government has brought forward, they didn't accept our amendments. So the statement that we aren't supporting this is inaccurate. We absolutely are supporting this piece of legislation. It does strengthen the ability to prevent sex offenders from changing their name. There is some solace in that for the survivors of those sex offenders to know that the person that changed their life forever is not going to be able to hide. There's absolute comfort that comes from that. But what we are saying is that more needs to happen. Yeah. When we see a government that takes away from the Victims of Crime Fund and not put supports in place to actually support the victims that we're trying to support, it's frustrating to stand in this House and be told that we're not on side with what the government is doing. That is absolutely not what's occurring. We're saying we need more. The people of Alberta, survivors of Alberta, have bravely shared stories over and over and over with all members of this side of the House, expressing concern about access to resources, expressing concern about cuts. So when we're talking in this place about what needs to happen and our support regarding legislation, I think we have the ability to also question government about what more are they doing, what more can be done. And I think it's fair to say when we're talking about legislation that actually says protecting Albertans from convicted sex offenders, we need to talk about the Albertans that have been perpetrated on by the sex offenders. And to me, that means supporting them. And to many members in this chamber, it means supporting them. But it needs more on top of this piece of legislation to occur. So we have extensive knowledge in this House, and I think that it's incredible that this loophole was identified, and I thank those people that brought this forward. But I'm also asking government to take some of the experience and the knowledge that we've been providing, not just as ourselves as individuals, but on behalf of Albertans. I know many of my colleagues have stood in this chamber and shared stories, numerous stories, heartbreaking stories about survivors of sexual violence. And to discredit or not listen to them is tough. I know for myself personally, at 18 years old, as soon as I was allowed to volunteer at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, I did. That was my very first opportunity to volunteer with that wonderful organization. And I'm proud that I was able to do that. And hearing the heart-wrenching stories and the pleas of feeling isolated, feeling alone, feeling not believed, is something that I think will never leave you. And so knowing that I have this experience, several members in the chamber have a background of social work, and knowing the impact of hearing those stories on members of the chamber that don't have that background and that training, it's hard. Hearing members from all areas of the province express some of those stories, it's something that you will never forget. And so when we're talking about the offender, we can't lose sight of the reason we're talking about the offender, and it's that person that they offended on, the person that they changed their life forever. So we need to talk about how important this piece of legislation is, and I support it, but we can't talk about it without saying we need to remember why we're doing this. And it's not only to prevent future assaults from potentially happening. If a police record check is pulled and this person's information comes up, it's identifying that this person is there. We have national registries that already exist that allow for information sharing across the country, but knowing that Alberta is taking this step is incredible. And I really think that in order to have a government that is saying that a priority is protecting Albertans, we need to look at those that they are protecting and be able to honestly say that everything possible is being done to ensure that that survivor is taken care of and that that survivor has the reports or the resources that they need to continue coping, sometimes every day, with this trauma that's occurred. I know that for many, hearing that this piece of legislation has passed will be a sigh of relief. It's that strength. Sometimes it's needed for a survivor to hear that their offender can't get away with hiding and can't change their name legally. So I absolutely think this is the right step. I'm just saying that I need to see more, and I'm hearing from so many across the province that more needs to be done. And so with that, Madam Speaker, I'll close my comments and just again say that I do support this legislation, and I hope that this isn't where it stops. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Glenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and to the Minister for bringing this bill forward. I've had a chance to speak to it at an earlier stage, but I am grateful to be here today and an opportunity to speak at third as well, because I think it's important to say very clearly that I support this, our caucus supports this. We think it is a good step. We've also said that we think that there is more that could and should be done. And we will continue to advocate for that because while banning the legal name change of an individual is a good step. It doesn't actually ban them from going by other names. It just bans them from legally changing their names. And we know that regularly in society, probably in this place, many people don't go by the legal name that their mom and dad gave them. Often they'll go by a middle name instead of their first name, or go by an abbreviated name, or sometimes go by a nickname altogether. So I think it is a good step to ban the changing of legal names. I think in actuality, and some members in prior stages of this bill talked about, well, because somebody will have to, say to somebody what their name is before they try to develop that relationship or lure them into a position where they could assault them. I think that's, I don't think that that's reflective of reality. I think that if somebody always introduced themselves by their legal given name, and therefore we were all magically safer automatically, we would have a very different society. I don't think that's the reality. I think the main route, and I want to thank the member for Edmonton Castle Downs for talking about enhanced supports for survivors, but I think the other big way we change us from having the society we do and the amount of domestic and physical violence and sexual violence is through education and through love. And I think that one of the ways we can best do that is by committing to updating our curriculum in this province, something that's been long overdue for a number of years. I think the curriculum redesign started under now Justice Hancock, then when he was the education minister, inspiring education. I attended a number of those sessions. I feel that we are long overdue for adding things like a comprehensive understanding of what consent is. And when your consent isn't honored, what your opportunities are to articulate that, and how you can push back and how you can fight for your rights if your consent isn't withheld. So I think that that's one area I would really like to see this government express some commitment and some drive to moving forward in a very quick fashion, because I think it is long overdue. We would have already been through phase one of the implementation of the new curriculum last fall, almost a year ago, if we would have continued with the plan that had been mapped out by the previous government. So I really do urge the government to take the brakes off that and get on with making sure our kids have a curriculum that reflects the reality in which we all live today. And the other piece I want to highlight is at the same time that measures like this are being brought in around legal name changes, which again, to be very clear, I support this piece of legislation. At the same time, we're seeing a retraction in the supports and services that meet the needs of folks in this sector. So we see cuts to the budget for children's services. We see cuts to the budgets for community and social services. And we see a general tone of threats of fiscal reckonings in this province by the Premier, again, yet today, that there will be a fiscal reckoning to come. And again, folks who've survived such harm, I think, deserve to know that the folks who represent them are going to put them first, their needs first, and will fight for them. But while we see pieces of legislation being brought forward that make small changes, we see system-wide deterioration to the supports that survivors need in the long term, and that we all need to ensure that we address the societal norms and the societal assumptions that have resulted in such harm in the past. So I think that this bill doesn't move backwards. I think it does move a little bit forwards, but I think there is so much more that we all need to do and should be doing together as legislators in this place. So with that, again, I do support this bill. Our caucus supports this bill, but we would like to see the government reflect the words and the title through its actions and through its budget. Full stop. So to continue to erode the protections for the vulnerable, I think speaks to some of the real challenges we have with this government and how they are addressing governing in this province and who they are governing for. But with regard to this bill, I'm happy to vote in support. Thank you.
Remember, Standing Order 29 2A is available. Seeing none, any members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to take a brief moment to speak to Bill 28, the Vital Statistics Protecting Albertans from Convicted Sex Offenders Amendment Act. I've had the chance to learn a lot over the years in talking with women that I have known. And indeed, in those conversations, it was stunning to me to learn how unfortunately universal an experience this is for many women. It's something that we perhaps don't recognize or talk about nearly enough, though I think we are making some good steps forward as a society in recognizing the harassment and indeed abuse, and unfortunately sometimes some very intense sexual offenses which are committed against women. And indeed, how often they are made to feel uncomfortable by men in the spaces in which they live or work or play. And indeed, far too often, excuses are made, or, men who commit these crimes are allowed to go free and not pay the consequence, or in some cases, as we're talking about here today, where they have in fact been convicted of an offense, to try to find some way to rehabilitate their character or escape the consequences of what they have done. Of course, none of us likes to see that happen, Madam Speaker. We all believe that anyone who commits such an offense should be held accountable, and I should be clear that this is not necessarily just about offenses against women. Certainly there are sexual offenses that are committed by women, and there are sexual offenses that are committed by men against men, or there's many different circumstances. But we do recognize that, unfortunately, disproportionately, women are the object of these sexual offenses. So I support the government in bringing this bill forward, a bill which amends the Vital Statistics Act so that anyone changing their name is required to submit to a criminal record check. And if that individual, in fact, is guilty of a sexual offense, they cannot change their name. That for the safety of those that have been hurt, that were the victims of that offense, or others who might be concerned for their safety, the name of the individual who has committed such an offense remains the same, so that it can be known and they can have that knowledge and that safety. That's a reasonable step, and I think many of my colleagues have spoken and laid out why. Indeed, anyone who has been the victim of a sexual offense should be able to have the ability and the safety to know that the person who committed that offense against them, they will always be able to track or identify. But as my colleagues have also noted, this is one step amongst many that are important in supporting the victims of sexual violence. There are many, many other responsibilities that we have as elected officials, and indeed that a government has, to support people who have endured sexual violence. The Victims of Crime Fund is an essential part of providing those supports, in helping them to be able to afford to access counseling, perhaps helping them financially when they have for a period been unable to work during a period when they were recovering from the violence that was visited on them. That is incredibly important. Unfortunately, we have just seen a bill which perhaps may jeopardize the ability of some individuals who have undergone sexual violence to seek that help, be able to afford to get that assistance. That is concerning to me, Madam Speaker. And that is another piece for which we are responsible. So this bill is an important and valuable one. But we need to go beyond simply the punitive justice measures, which are important and are needed, but are not all. And unfortunately, at times, I see governments that fixate on the punitive measures, but do not consider the social investments, the many other factors which impact individuals who have undergone or are victims of a crime, like sexual violence, but instead choose to fixate only on the law and order pieces and the tough on crime. It is a balance, Madam Speaker, and the step that the government is taking is, again, a good one. I support it. It is part of that balance. But there are many other pieces which, unfortunately, this government, I feel, is putting out of balance and is failing to address. And it is my hope that our belief in morality will not simply stop at a bill like this, but will extend to all areas where we are considering how government invests and supports and puts and uses its leadership and its power to ensure that victims of sexual violence are not left without the many supports they need. Beyond simply knowing that they know the name of the person that committed that violence against them. Also knowing that they can access the mental health supports they need, the physical health supports that they may need. That the community organizations that have been there to help them are funded and supported. Indeed, that their own economic well-being will not be compromised. So I will be happy to vote in favor of this bill. But I will also continue to work with all of my colleagues in the official opposition to hold the government to account on all areas where we are providing support for victims of sexual violence and that affect their lives. I'd also like to take the opportunity while I have the floor to just recognize a guest that came here today, Tori Newisna, who was here for the tabling of the petition earlier. Thank you, Tori, for joining us. Because this is all part of our democratic process, indeed. And I'm happy on Bill 28 to support a good decision of the government, but also to continue to use the democratic process to hold this government to account in other areas where they may fall short. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Well, members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to speak to the bill? Seeing none, would the minister like to close debate? All right. Honorable members, third reading of Bill 28, the Vital Statistics Protecting Albertans from Convicted Sex Offenders Amendment Act 2020. Those in favor of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried.
Bill 28, Vital Statistics Protecting Albertans from Convicted Sex Offenders Amendment Act 2020 is now read a third time. Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 27, Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act 2020, debate adjourned. Member Loyola speaking.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Ellerslie.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I do believe I ran out of time last time we were discussing this particular bill, and I was actually addressing comments made by the member from, if I could just remember here, from Tabor-Warner, actually. And I was sharing with the members of this House that when we were in government, the Alberta NDP, I had the honor of having a discussion with the member from Tabor-Warner right here on the steps of this very legislature. And we were discussing how, even though we have differing perspectives, at the end of the day, we care deeply about Alberta, and we care deeply about our families and how they are represented, and the fact that we all want what's best for Alberta. And it is with that in mind that I get up to speak to Bill 27, because I feel that we're actually going back in time rather than moving forward on this particular issue, with the fact that we have the reintroduction of, not only with this bill, of course, with Bill 27, but also with Bill 28, a total of $530,000 of money that won't necessarily be transparently disclosed to the Alberta public on how it will be influencing the democratic process. Now, I'll remind you, Madam Speaker, that I believe we had the honor of sitting together, if I'm not mistaken, on the Select Special Committee for Ethics and Accountability, if I'm not mistaken.
Speaker may or may not ever have sat on any committees outside of this legislature.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. That being the case, I do remember spending a significant amount of time in committee on these particular issues and being absolutely adamant that if money was to be spent during an election process, that those money should be then disclosed to the Alberta public. And what we see here in this particular bill is that the money's not going to be traceable. People won't know. People won't know who put money into particular ad campaigns in order to know who is actually trying to influence the opinion of members of the Alberta public. Because that's what this is about at the end of the day, Madam Speaker. In our democracy, we have different ways of making sure that we honor the democratic process. And of course, it's one person, one vote. And people are free to vote in whichever way they want, and we respect that, because this is democracy. But the other part of that is the fact that we also live in a society where repeatedly, time and time again, special interests, particular stakeholders, will spend money to sway the opinion of particular members of the Alberta public to vote in a particular way. This is a very real fact. It's very real. So that being the case, we can't stop it from happening. I mean, to stop people from actually spending money on advertising campaigns, which is their free right to do so, would be unconstitutional. I recognize that. And by no means am I suggesting at any time that we do not permit this to happen. But what I am asking this government to do is to respect precedent that was already set by the Select Special Committee for Ethics and Accountability, where we all agreed that moving forward in this fine province, we would make sure that if money were to be spent on advertising in an election campaign, any election campaign, that those monies be then disclosed to the Alberta public. And this particular cabinet wants to move us back in time. Move us back in time when that wasn't disclosed. And I asked the members opposite, how is this respecting our democracy? How is this respecting precedent already set? One of the things that we were very happy to do when we were in government with our very first bill is to ban corporate and union donations. And notice it wasn't one-sided. It wasn't just, okay, we're banning corporate donations. No, because we understood and that we need to be fair. We need to be fair with our democratic process. And what's good for one side is also good for the other. So it's with that I asked the members opposite, then why are you doing this? Those members of cabinet in particular, I'm asking, why is it that you want to take us back in time to the way things were done before when monies spent in elections were not disclosed? And unfortunately, it has to, and I can't not talk about the track record of this very premier who stated that he would disclose, he actually stated that he would disclose who funded his leadership campaign. And to this day, he has not put that information forward. He has not put that information forward. What is this premier trying to hide? Why now do we have a cabinet in front of us bringing a piece of legislation that wants to continue how monies are spent in a in an election. Why? This is the question that we are on this side asking ourselves. It's not that we don't believe in referendum. It's not that we don't believe that Albertans should have an opinion on people who could potentially be their senator. That's not the case. Our critique of this piece of legislation firmly stands on the fact that, again, we have the introduction of dark money into Alberta politics. That's what it's about. So for once, I'd like to see members opposite actually get up and speak specifically to what I'm talking about right now. Don't confuse the debate. Don't say that we're saying something that we're not saying. Don't put words in our mouth when you get up to speak and say, oh, you guys don't believe in having a referendum, because that's not what I'm saying. Don't get up and state that we don't believe that people should be able to vote for their senator or who they think. If that's what is the piece of legislation before us, then I would strongly support that. But specifically, I want members opposite to get up and speak about why they are reintroducing dark money back into the political process here in the province of Alberta. That is my focus. Because from my time on the Select Special Committee for Ethics and Accountability, my dream has been to strengthen democracy here in the province of Alberta as much as we possibly can. As much as we possibly can. And by now, I think that members know firmly the history from which I came from. And I don't need to, continually repeat it. But I stand up for democracy because the reason why I'm here in Canada is that we didn't have that opportunity. We didn't have the opportunity to make sure that our human rights were respected. And it's within this arena, within this particular political arena, as well as others, within the judicial system and other orders of government, that we need to raise our voices, and not just as politicians in this House, but then also stand up with the people who are fighting to make sure that their rights are respected. We had a firm example of that just a few weeks ago with the Black Lives Matter movement, where more than 15,000 people came onto the grounds of this legislature to demand that human rights be respected all over this nation, specifically for Black people and specifically for Indigenous people. It was an amazing act of solidarity between people of different cultural backgrounds. I remember walking through the grounds with pride as I saw Muslim brothers and sisters of mine attending that particular demonstration. Because when it impacts one group of people, it impacts us all. And this is what we need to take into consideration when we start thinking about how money can again have the potential to sway. Because that's the intent, Madam Speaker. That is the reason why people spend money on ads in an election campaign, is to particularly sway people's opinion when it comes to casting their vote in that particular election. And the very least that we can give to the Alberta public is to tell them, look, the person who spent that money on that particular ad, this is who they are.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate? The Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair, or Madam Speaker, my apologies. So this is my first opportunity to rise and speak to Bill 27. And I just want to, again, clarify that, as my honourable member, my colleague in our caucus was mentioning, is that our caucus does not have an issue with having referendums or having elections called or having Albertans participate in democracy. Where we disagree with the government is around how that is done and why it is that money and third-party advertising and all of these different changes that the government has now chosen to make are being done within these pieces of legislation. So what we've seen with Bill 27, because I mean this bill was only reintroduced a year ago, and now we're back again, amending it again. And what we're seeing here is that the amendments that are being created under the Elections Amendment Act are actually specific to labeling of the ability to fundraise. So we see in some of the sections where it starts to reference, instead of campaign advertising, it's now Senate campaign advertising, or Senate fundraising, or different things like that, where basically the language within the Act has changed it from just political advertising to specify Senate. And now, when we look at that, you know, it seems like it's, you know, not a big deal. Maybe it's housekeeping. Maybe the government would even say it's like red tape reduction or whatever. But what we know is that when we look at Bill 26 and then Bill 27 combined, is that what has actually happened is that through changing of the language in the Act around being able to do Senate advertising expenses and Senate fundraising expenses, that what's actually happened now is that an individual between Bill 26 and 27 can actually, under third-party advertising, submit expenses to the elections officer under two different now named categories. So there used to be a cap. There used to be this third-party advertising cap, which would have been distinct for all political engagement. But what's happened now is that an individual can claim, you know, $350,000 without audited expenses under the referendum advertising expenses. And then they can go under the Senate Election Amendment Act, and they can claim another $150,000 under the Senate third-party advertising. And as we start to see, and as we start to look at all of these different pieces of legislation, the numbers really start to add up. And there's little loopholes and little pockets that are created for all of these different abilities, so that when an election is called, let's say under the future municipal election, we have also a Senate election, and we also have a referendum question that's been asked at the same time. And now we have all of these different pockets where a lot of money for people that really want to be able to influence an election have the capacity to do it under a variety of different pieces of legislation, all at the same time. So I find that really interesting, and this again is where we fundamentally have a concern with how this is being done. It's not about democracy for Albertans and ensuring Albertans have a voice, because if that was the case, then we wouldn't even be dealing with Bill 27, because all really Bill 27 does is creates a financial administration component. And that would be the same with the referendum bill. So again, referendums are fine, depending on whether or not there's big money in it. Our leader's been very, very clear. Senate elections are fine. They aren't really binding. Federal government can still decide who they want to appoint as a senator, whether we have an election or not. So they're kind of it's a great, nod to the base for the government, but it, again, isn't binding. So it's here or there, but what it does allow is a lot of money to get introduced into elections because of the piece of legislation. But the piece that I also find super interesting, and what I still have a really interesting disconnect and cognitive disconnect between what the government is trying to do and when it comes to all of this democracy stuff is that the government created a committee called the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee, which we have members of the opposition on and members of the government on. This whole committee, the whole intent of it, from what I understand, to be fair, we haven't had our first meeting yet. I believe it's on Monday. And I am a member of the committee, so I guess I'll learn what we're going to be talking about. But there's this committee that this government has created, and yet currently we have 3 pieces of legislation in front of us that are influencing the elections of municipal Senate referendums. Some could even argue that Bill 32, when you look at the financial implications in the labor pieces of legislation, are actually somewhat of an election democratic jigging piece of legislation. And so I'm not really sure why we have this special committee. And so because of that, I actually have an amendment, Madam Speaker, which I can read into the record if you would like.
Just wait until I have a copy. Known as Amendment RA1, please proceed to read it into the record.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker. RA1. Okay, my apologies. So the honourable member to move that the motion for second reading of Bill 27, the Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act 2020, be amended by deleting all of the words after that and substituting the following. Bill 27, Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act 2020, be now not read a second time, because the Assembly is of the view that this legislation should not proceed until such time as the Assembly can consider any recommendations made by the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee. Now, Madam Speaker, the reason that I feel like this is appropriate, that it not be read a second time, is, well, as I indicated when I first stood up, this is actually now the second time that this piece of legislation has been introduced into the House in the last 15 months. We saw this bill actually June last year, so we're at the 1-year anniversary of this piece of legislation, and the government has already had to bring it back into the chamber to be amended and discussed once again. So, you know, first time's okay, second time, we'll see. Maybe third time's the charm, I'm not quite sure. So, you know, to support the government and maybe give them an opportunity to not have to then bring this piece of legislation back into the chamber for the third time, they may want to hold off on this particular piece of legislation, not have it read a second time, and wait and see that through the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee, whether or not there will be recommendations made that may potentially impact this piece of legislation again, and so they won't have to then amend it and bring it back for the third time. So, again, I think that this is a pretty reasonable amendment, given that, you know, the government created the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee. They have the majority on the committee. We all know what that means in this chamber. So, you know, they'll be able to look at what makes sense. And you would think that instead of having all of these pieces of legislation that do specifically with elections, that they would actually use the committee to review the pieces of legislation and make sure that what they're doing isn't then going to require even more amendments to pieces of legislation. So I'm just here to help. Would like to encourage all the members of the chamber to vote in favor of this so that, again, the government doesn't have to amend this piece of legislation for the third time.
Well, members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none. Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment RA1 on Bill 27? The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak to amendment, the RA1. Okay, so to speak to Bill 27, the amendment, Bill 27, Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act. So I did speak to this bill in earlier this week. And so it's my pleasure to rise and add some additional thoughts and maybe underline some of the things that I said at that time. So I think it's, as I said earlier, let me first say that I think it's a good idea to send this piece of legislation to committee. As my colleague noted, this is the second time that we're dealing with this issue, and I think we could all agree that there's limited time that we have to debate legislation in this place. And I think given the enormous challenges that we face, not just in Alberta, but in Canada, globally, whether it's, the pandemic, commodity prices, the crash, the challenge in the economy, job losses, all of the things that are going on, I think that we have a limited amount of time to deal with legislation to actually make lives better for Alberta. And so I would suggest that pausing this, given, there are some issues with it, but taking it to a committee for things to slow down a little bit and for people to really have a look at this. And I would also suggest that maybe inviting stakeholders, stakeholders such as members from the AUMA, I think would be a great idea to get their thoughts. And one of the things, and I believe one of my colleagues tabled this document, but if not, I will table it on Monday. But there was a statement released, and this wasn't too long ago, it was on June 24th, and it was a statement from AUMA President Barry Morishito. AUMA is committed to fair local elections. I think that that title certainly says it all. I have no doubt whatsoever that the leadership of AUMA and all of the members are indeed committed to fair and local elections. But they did, in their comments, they did outline some principles, some really basic principles that they wanted all of us to think about. And I think that it's important that we go through these and really think about this. When we look at Bill 27 and look at all of the potential things that can happen as a result, and we've talked about that. It's not just Bill 27, but Bill 26 and 27 together. And again, let me just preface all of this by saying nobody's in any way opposed to referendums. What we're opposed to, what we have concerns about, is bringing in more money in terms of third-party advertising that is really difficult to track and to trace. And so those are generally the concerns. And I also mentioned previously that local leaders, I know in my case, the City of St. Albert, I know the mayor was publicly reported that one of the things that she values, and I completely agree with her, is that the local municipal elections are about local issues, that they are truly, genuinely local elections about local issues that are important. There is no, as much as possible, I mean, nobody's perfect, but as much as possible, that there is no interference in terms of political ideology or politics, provincial politics, much less federal politics. But anyway, going back to Mr. Morishita's statement about the principles, and they include some things I think that we would probably all agree with. The first one is democracy, that they are democratic, autonomous, local, inclusive and fair, enforceable, scalable, transparent, and nonpartisan. And I think those are generally excellent principles when you are looking at democracy, and particularly based on this statement, their view of local and municipal elections, why it's so important to preserve the integrity of those elections. And so when you have a piece of legislation like Bill 27, Alberta's Senate Election Amendment Act, and again, this is not about a referendum in any way, this is about the loopholes that are created with this piece of legislation to introduce more influence in terms of money. I mean, that's what it is, right? It allows more money to be introduced into elections. Now, coincidentally, this election, this Senate election, would run at the same time as the municipal election, where we, reeves and mayors and councillors, trustees are elected, that we are confusing things. The other day, one of my colleagues talked about I don't remember the year, but it was an election that there was also a Senate election. And, it was hard to tell who was who because of the colors of the signs, let's say. So sometimes, and there are some people, we are, I think, highly attuned to politics, but not everybody is, especially when you look at local elections about local issues. Not everybody there is informed about what's going on federally or provincially, and often have no idea, what's going on in terms of electing someone to suggest the federal government appoint to the Senate. So I think the concern is about money. And so some of the things that Bill 26 and 27 do, it literally allows hundreds of thousands of dollars to be raised and spent to influence public opinion on political matters with limited oversight and transparency, and only the Premier's permission. And I think that, certainly I understand that the head of government, the leader of this province, has a degree of authority and power that other people do not have. However, I think when it comes to things as important as this, it's really vital that there be as much transparency as possible. So the changes to the Senate Election Act allow for third-party advertisers to have a Senate election advertising account to keep referendum, Senate, local, and provincial issues separate. Now, I think we also talked about at length, when you look at both of these pieces of legislation, so if you were to have an election as well as a Senate election and then a referendum, you're introducing all of these loopholes and opening all of these windows for third-party advertising for big money, and not all of which will be easily traced back to its source. And I think that's pretty clear in the legislation. And I think if you're going to add questions about who's paying for what, who's paying for the signs, who's paying for the billboards, who's paying for the radio ads, who's paying for all of those things, if we can't readily understand or know who's doing that, how do you make an informed decision? Because I think we can all agree that advertising plays a role in politics. We know this. That's why we all fundraise. We know that elections are coming. We know that we are going to have to spend money on all of these things. And I think what we tried to do with the Special Ethics and Accountability All-Party Committee, that was years ago now, what we tried to do as much as possible was level the playing field, so that we brought it down. Literally, it was like, at the time, it was like Albertans could donate like $30,000, I think, to multiple people. Actually, I could be wrong about that. I'll have to check. But what we changed it to was a maximum $4,000 per person, per Albertan, no corporations, no unions, but actual people, that the maximum was $4,000, and that was all in. So that could be multiple candidates, that could be, all to one, to the party, doesn't matter. But that was to the leadership, yeah. So that was it. This particular piece of legislation, under the guise, once again, of doing a Senate election, opens doors to big money. So we already dealt with the Senate election. We already had the ability to do that, Madam Speaker. I think this new piece of legislation, or this new amendment, isn't about, fixing maybe a couple of phrases that weren't quite right. This is about money. This is about influencing elections, and that's not what elections are supposed to be about. I don't believe they are. And I think, we talked a little bit about, I think that all of us, I would hope that all of us have a goal or hope that one day that this chamber is easily accessible to all people, so that we see the diversity in this place that is reflected in the province in terms of age, that we have people that all different ages, that we have, at the very least, a balance in terms of gender, that we have people with all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of religious beliefs, all kinds of ideas, because that, I believe, when you actually approach a problem and try to create a solution, when you have that kind of diversity and those kinds of fresh ideas from different perspectives, you actually go further. And, that might sound, like I'm wearing some rose-colored glasses, but that is my belief. And I believe that one of the major well, maybe not the major, but a serious barrier for people getting into politics, even at a municipal level, I would say. I can't comment on school boards and things, but at a municipal level, there is a responsibility to raise a fair amount of money, not just to create the infrastructure in terms of volunteers and a plan and all of those things, but there's a lot of money that you have to raise. And so it requires you to engage with the people whose vote you are looking for. And it requires you to reach out to them and ask them to support you, whether it's with their vote or with time or with money. When you open things up and introduce money that you can't actually even track, money that is introduced into an election that seeks to influence the outcome of an election, you start to remove, I think, some of the most basic principles of elections, that it is fair, that it is transparent, that it is open to all people who are eligible. And I don't believe this piece of legislation does that. I didn't believe it earlier this week, and I most definitely don't believe it today. So I would hope that the members, it's not been the pattern of late that they accept any amendments that we make. I shouldn't say any, there's probably been a couple. I don't know what they are, but there's probably been a couple. That they considered that some of the concerns that we've raised about this piece of legislation. And again, I want to say that ideal elections, and I think that, when we all stand up and talk about the importance of democracy and protecting democracy, I think that what we all believe, I hope what we all believe, is that people, ultimately, it's about electors choosing people to represent them, whether it's on a city council, whether it's on a school board, or whether it's in the Alberta legislature. But they're electing people that they believe can do a good job representing them to whatever body they're electing them to. And so it shouldn't be about big money purchasing and their purchasing power in terms of advertising to sway voters. It should not be about that. It needs to be as grassroots level as possible. I mean, I can remember, I think probably every election that we've had in the last little while, there's always the debate about, why do we have to have so many signs? Like, why couldn't we just save all the money with the signs and, we wouldn't have to recycle them all, and right? And we wouldn't have to take them all down the next day, and it wouldn't be like, there wouldn't be vandalism on the signs. That always happens. But, I think the basic, it's sort of funny because we all do it with signs, I get it. But I think that basically what people are saying is, it's not about that. It's not about how many signs you have or how nice they look or the best locations that you have. It's about the ideas, and it's about the person. And does that person match your ideals? Do you believe that person can represent you? And so going back to the basics of elections is that if we bring in more dark money, more money that we can't trace, we start to erode that. So when you are, the other thing I would like to say is, I'm not going to assign, not motives, but I'm not going to sort of guess what people would do. So people that are backed by dark money, whatever. We know, I think that we can be pretty clear about saying that when people invest a lot of money in something, they're usually doing it for a reason. So for example, lobbyists, that's what they do, right? They have budgets, they spend their budgets, and they do it for a reason. They lobby for a reason. They want something done. They need something done. So it is not unusual for lobbyists with big pockets, deep pockets, to introduce a lot of money into elections to expect something in return. I'm not saying that there's a backroom deal, where they've signed off on something, but that generally is the expectation, unless the lobbyist just simply likes the person a lot and just wants to give them a whole big bunch of money, never see them again. So I would suggest that when we start to introduce a lot of money into elections, there's a reason why lobbyists and why special interest groups, whether they are corporations, whether they're unions, whether they are lobbyists, whether they are family groups, whether they are groups of lawyers, whether they are, whatever they are, they have a reason for doing that, for investing. And so, which is why I was so proud of the work with the special ethics and accountability, is that we brought the number down and we made it fair as possible. It was an all-party committee. We had a lot of debate about where we should land, about PACs. We had a lot of debate about all kinds of things, but we landed on that number, and it was a $4,000 number across the board.
Oh, what would we do without our signs? 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Associate Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the caucus across for putting forward what I would describe as a thoughtful amendment for a caucus that doesn't embrace democracy. But when we look at the amendment, Madam Speaker, it's a step backwards, and it doesn't enhance this piece of legislation in any way. Now, it's getting late in the day. It's the end of the debate week, if you will, and I just can't help but remind myself of what my grandfather used to say. He used to have this saying where you don't let the fox guard the hen house. And the reason I think of that is so appropriate today is because we have a caucus that has proven when it comes to democratic values, such as the secret ballot during union certifications, is not something they embrace. They're against that. And so that was something that we had to bring back in. Now, we see the secret ballot as the most basic tenet of democracy. And when you don't have the secret ballot during union certifications, it leads to all sorts of other types of abuses. It was clear during their 4 years in government that that government was a caucus that chose to stack the deck as much in their favor as possible. And we even see it with the citizen referendums we've talked about in this House. The NDP are not a caucus that embraces citizen referendums. And again, we don't understand that, because what is more basic and what is more democratic than something basic and direct like a citizen referendum? So just the fact, Madam Speaker, that they've demonstrated that they don't embrace the same democratic values that we do. We see this amendment as a step backwards and not a step forward. So I would encourage all of the members on this side of the House to turn down this amendment. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Any other members understanding Order 29-2A? The Honourable Member for Edmonton-McLeod.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to speak to Bill 27. We're on 29-2A, or that? Yeah, that's why I thought a pleasure to rise and discuss some of the comments that have been made by honourable members in this House regarding the amendment. And we just listened to a member of the Government Caucus speak about the democratic process and enhancing democracy, and I can't think of anything more beneficial to the democratic process by having a very critical and detailed analysis of the piece of legislation done by a special committee that is struck precisely for that purpose. And to have the honourable member describe that as somehow a step backwards behooves imagination, because in fact that is believed what that committee was struck to do. And giving this work to the committee by passing the amendment to refer to committee this bill is certainly the right thing to do. There is a triumvirate of pieces of legislation for this House that are somewhat related, and I would argue, Madam Speaker, that it would be beneficial to have all three of them sitting before the committee for consideration in detail, because of course nothing could be more democratic than to have that committee struck for that purpose to actually look in detail at how those the pieces of legislation work together, because they were designed, Madam Speaker, to work together, as I described them, a triumvirate. I would even go further to say that there will be the government's crosses to bear should they end up passing this House and becoming law. There are three crosses to bear, Madam Speaker, and I would say each of them represent a crucifixion of democracy that will have their own stories, whether it be the Bill 27 that we're talking today and the amendment to refer to the committee, the Senate election amendment, or whether it be the other two, whether with respect to referendums and local authority elections. That collection of three pieces of legislation should all, in my view, Madam Speaker, go to the committee for very, very detailed scrutiny, and it certainly is a timely and opportune moment to be able to make use of this committee that the government struck for an untold purpose. To this point, we are handing to them a golden opportunity to say, indeed, let's use that committee to look in detail at these pieces of legislation, including Bill 27, which we are hoping to refer to the committee. And
any other members wishing to speak on Amendment RA1, Bill 27? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise to speak to Bill 27. Of course, the amendment that's before us, that this legislation be not now read a second time, because the Assembly is of the view that this legislation should not proceed until such time as the Assembly can consider any recommendations by the Select Special Democratic Accountability Committee. And I think that it's a very reasonable request, considering the changes that are being proposed and the ability of that committee to do this very important work. And through the speech of the member from Edmonton Ellerslie, we had the opportunity to hear that, that member and several other members in this chamber that are here today, that were here over the last 4 years, had the opportunity to review other pieces of election legislation to ensure that we were doing our best to support democracy in our province. And I think that at this time, with what is being proposed to us, that the only thing that I can currently support is the idea of moving this to committee for further review. The problem is that I was really hoping that we would see a piece of legislation come forward about Senate elections that I would be able to support. And the same goes for the piece of legislation on municipal campaign funding, and the same goes for the idea of referendums. I support in principle the idea of ensuring that Albertans have the opportunity, no matter what party they support or who they vote for. I support the idea of direct democracy and offering Albertans the ability to speak, whether it's about Senate elections or any other referendum issue. The problem that I have, which is very unfortunate, because I did hope that I would be able to support a piece of legislation to this effect, but the problem that I'm seeing within this legislation is that it's not so much about ensuring grassroots ideas are able to make it to the position of being called to a referendum. The problem here is that it's really just an opportunity for the UCP to allow massive amounts of unaccountable money to influence decisions, whether it be different elections, provincial, municipal, or the idea of referendum, no matter what it is. We're seeing the influence of big money coming back into the picture, and it's been spoken about at length, the work that we did to ban corporate union donations when we were in government, to reduce the per individual contributor amount per year to $4,000 from $15,000. And unfortunately, what we're seeing here is a massive amount of money being brought back into the system, not only through this bill, but through the other two bills that are brought forward, without the accountability measures that need to be in place to ensure that Albertans know where that money and that influence is coming from. And once again, the member from Edmonton Ellerslie went on about the idea that, the idea of advertising being involved in elections is a democratic value, and it's something that I support as well. And it was a discussion that came up a lot when we were talking about the influence of PACs over the last four years, and the decisions that we made about doing our best to make them accountable. And if anything, this UCP government should have came to the table and said, we are going to work to strengthen what was already in place. But we have seen the exact opposite. And I think back to when those discussions were happening with Bill 1, of course, the NDP's very first bill that came before the legislature to ban corporate union donations, to create more accountability within the money and the advertising that was influencing elections. And I remember the leader of the Wild Rose Party at the time talking about how we needed to do more about accountability, how potentially even that $4,000 individual contributor amount per year was maybe even too much. And I think about the talking points that the Wild Rose Party and even members that are here today that were there at that time raised concerns about the influence of money coming in, even with the restrictions that we had put in. And so I'm very concerned that now we get into a place where some of those Wild Rose members are now in government, and some of them are sitting at the cabinet table, and they have totally changed their opinion and their values on the importance of accountability in elections and the importance of accountability in money being spent in our province. And I really question why we've gotten to this point and how we've gotten to this point. That not long ago, it wasn't a long 4 years ago, that the Wild Rose, who are currently sitting in this House, raised very valid arguments about the importance of that accountability. But now, when these members are in government, they've totally changed course. And that's very concerning for me. I'm not sure why they've changed their opinion of that. And I think it's unfortunate, because when we look at the value of a referendum, potentially, and giving Albertans the ability to vote on these things, that it is an important value, and it's something that I do support. But when we look in here that $30,000 for Senate elections, $500,000, $500,000 that can be spent on these questions that could influence a variety of things, but then it goes on to say that the Premier gets to choose what the question is going to be. And so if there's 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 signatories to a petition that comes forward on the idea of a referendum, well, they don't actually get to choose what that question is. The Premier does. And that doesn't seem very democratic to me, Madam Speaker. And so for that reason and a variety of other reasons that we see in here, that the Premier could choose which demographics could vote, which regions of the province could vote on a referendum that could decide across the board changes for all Albertans, I'm very saddened that this is how this piece of legislation came forward. I understand that this was a commitment from the UCP in their campaign platform. I don't think that they had explained quite enough how much they were planning to let big money back into it at the same time. So with that being said, unfortunately at this time I will not be supporting Bill 27. I appreciate that the government tried to bring something forward, but I think it needs to go back to the drawing board, and which is why I'm supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Well, members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate? Seeing none, would the Honourable, we will vote on the amendment. On Amendment RA1 is moved by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. The amendment has been defeated. We are back on the main bill. Are there any speakers wishing to join debate on Bill 27 in second reading? Seeing none, would the Minister like to close debate?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I close debate.
There we go. On second reading of Bill 27, the Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act 2020, does the Assembly agree to the motion for second reading? Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That is carried.
Bill 27, Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act 2020 is now read a second time. Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 25, Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act 2020, the Honourable Mr. Schweitzer.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Gas, the Honourable Associate Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to move on behalf of the Minister of Justice, third reading of Bill 25, the Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act 2020. The theft of metal poses a significant safety risk that Albertans have been asking government to address for many years. Criminals looking for a quick way to turn stolen property into cash often target the critical systems Albertans rely on, looking for valuable metals they can sell for scrap, with few questions asked. When the power goes out or when communication links are cut by thieves scavenging for valuable metal wires, it not only endangers Albertans, Madam Speaker, it disrupts our economy and comes at great cost to the companies that operate these essential networks. In recent months, we've also seen how metal theft hurts everyday Albertans, like the dozens of brass plaques stolen from memorial benches in Edmonton, and hundreds of catalytic converters stolen from people's vehicles throughout the province. Metal thieves often target isolated locations to avoid detection, which has put rural Albertans in particular danger from trespassers looking for items to steal. When I tour rural Alberta, Madam Speaker, people ask again and again for this government to do something about metal theft. We listened. In November 2019, we proclaimed the Scrap Metal Dealers and Recyclers Identification Act in response to long-standing calls from stakeholders and Albertans to make it more difficult for criminals to sell stolen metal for scrap. Bill 25 builds on those first steps by amending the Act and adding regulations that will deter, help metal theft, give law enforcement tools to detect it, and ensure meaningful consequences for people and businesses that deal in stolen property. If passed, the legislation will require dealers to report the purchase or receipt of restricted metals to law enforcement within 24 hours by entering the transaction details into a central database. This legislation would define scrap metal as new or used items made of non-ferrous metals that are commonly stolen, including, but not limited to, aluminum, brass, bronze, copper, and tin. The regulations further define the types of restricted metals that will be subject to reporting requirements. This includes several high theft items such as copper wires, cables and cable reels, catalytic converters, metal grave markers, funeral vases, memorial plaques and monuments, lead-acid batteries, and traffic and utility fixtures such as signs, manhole covers, and guardrails. The list is long, Madam Speaker. We'll also deter criminals by requiring sellers to provide government-issued identification beginning on September 1. As of September 1, dealers would also have to record information from a seller's ID as well as several other details of each transaction, including date and time, description of the metal, weight of the metal, make, model, color, and license plate number of any vehicle used by the seller. There are no minimum weight thresholds for scrap metal transactions, so criminals can avoid detection by parceling stolen goods into smaller batches. The legislation includes the establishment of a central database monitored by law enforcement for all reportable transactions involving restricted metals. Under provisions that would come into force on November 1, dealers would be required to report restricted metal transactions to law enforcement by entering them in the database within 24 hours of receipt. To further enhance the ability of law enforcement to investigate metal theft, police will have the authority to require dealers to hold on to material that is suspected of being stolen for up to 30 days. Another deterrent measure and another investigative aid for police is a ban on cash transactions that would take effect on November 1. From that point onward, all payments for scrap will have to be made using a form of traceable currency like an electronic transfer or check. The legislation will ensure broad compliance by requiring mobile scrap dealers, in addition to their larger non-mobile counterparts, to obtain and report information to law enforcement. For those who don't comply, there are stiff proposed penalties. For individuals, the maximum penalty for a first offense would increase to $10,000 or 1 year in jail or both. That is up from the current $5,000 maximum. The maximum fine for a second or subsequent offense would increase to $25,000 from $15,000. For corporations, the maximum fine for a first offense would increase to $50,000 from the current $15,000. For a second or subsequent offense, a corporation would face a maximum $200,000 fine, a significant increase from $50,000 currently on the books. The intent of this legislation is to deter and detect criminal activity that is endangering Albertans and harming our economy. However, we're also aware that selling metal for scrap is a legitimate legal enterprise for people and corporations and can be a source of income for charities and nonprofits. We don't want to increase the red tape burden on these groups, so this legislation exempts bottle depot operators, landfills, registered charities and nonprofit entities, and purchase of receipt of scrap metal from corporations. I request that we move third reading of Bill 25, the Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act 2020. I also see it's getting late in the day, Madam Speaker, and I move the Assembly adjourn until 1:30 p.m. on Monday, July 13th, 2020.
I'd like to adjourn debate on third reading first.
Sure.
Okay. Having heard the motion to adjourn debate, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say no. No. So carried. Having heard the motion to adjourn the House, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. House stands adjourned until Monday at 1:30.